Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into a world that existed just beyond closed doors, hidden behind velvet curtains and ornate wallpaper. Imagine this, a grand estate in Victorian England, gleaming chandeliers, marble floors that could reflect your face like a mirror. But here's what most people never knew. For every single member of the family living in splendour upstairs, there were 10, sometimes 20 people working invisibly below. These weren't just a few helpers, we're talking about an army. 50, 70, sometimes over 100 human beings, each with a specific task, each forbidden to be seen or heard. And tonight, we're going to step into their world. A world where a roast chicken had to be ready at any moment of the day or night, where bells rang incessantly from dawn until midnight, and where your entire existence depended on being perfectly invisible. So before we step through that servant's entrance together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if the story truly speaks to you. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom? A quiet corner somewhere? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, get comfortable, and let's walk through the hidden corridors of history together. Picture yourself standing outside Housekeeper House in Scotland on a crisp morning in 1895. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns that stretch as far as the eye can see. The main house, this magnificent palace of stone and glass, sits there like a crown jewel. But if you walked around to the back, past the gardens, past the stables, you'd find another entrance. A smaller door, unremarkable, almost hidden. This is where our story truly begins. Because behind that door lived an entire civilization that most of the world never saw. At Housekeeper House alone, there were nearly 100 staff members, 100 people each with their own uniform, their own rank, their own sleeping quarters, their own strict schedule. Think about that for a moment. 100 people working to make life comfortable for perhaps 10 family members and their occasional guests. It's almost impossible to imagine today, isn't it? We complain when we have to load our own dishwasher. But this was the reality across Britain during the Victorian and Edwardian eras. At Blair Castle in the Scottish Highlands, the numbers were similar, between 50 and 100 servants at any given time. At the estates owned by the Dukes of Buccleuch and Argyll, the staffs were even larger. These weren't just wealthy households. These were small towns operating entirely in service of a single family. Let me tell you about a place that really captures this absurdity, Welbeck Abbey. The 5th Duke of Portland, who lived there in the late 1800s, had a particular habit. He wanted roast chicken available whenever he fancied a slice. Not just at dinner time, not just at lunch. Any time, day or night. So one of his 38 kitchen servants, yes, you heard that right, 38 people working in the kitchen alone, had to ensure that a chicken was constantly rotating on the spit, perfectly roasted, just in case His Grace decided he wanted a piece at 3 in the morning. 38 people, just in the kitchen. Can you imagine the coordination required? The heat, the noise, the constant motion. And that was just one department of the household. Now you might be wondering, what did all these people actually do? Well, this is where it gets fascinating, because the Victorian, and Edwardian estates had developed an incredibly complex hierarchy. It wasn't just servants. It was your entire social structure, as rigidly defined as any military organisation. At the very top you had the house steward or the butler. We'll talk more about him later, but for now, know that he was like a general. He commanded all the male servants and answered only to the master of the house. His female counterpart was the housekeeper, who ruled over all the women with absolute authority. These two were the royalty of the servants' world. Below them came the upper servants, the cook, who, despite being crucial to the household's success, ranked below the butler and housekeeper, the lady's maid who dressed and undressed her mistress, styled her hair, and knew all her secrets, the valet who performed similar duties for the master. These were the elite, the trusted inner circle. Then you had the footmen, and here's where things get interesting. Footmen were chosen partly for their looks. Yes, you heard that right. They needed to be tall, handsome, and presentable, because they were part of the display of wealth. The first footman might accompany the lady of the house on outings, serve meals, assist the butler. The second footman would help him, and if the house was large enough, there might be a third footman doing even more menial tasks. But we're not done. You had housemaids, multiple housemaids, each with specific duties. The head housemaid, who supervised the others. Chambermaids, who dealt exclusively with bedrooms. Parlour maids, responsible for the drawing rooms and sitting rooms. Laundry maids, who spent their days washing and ironing mountains of linens and clothes. Kitchen maids, who assisted the cook. Scullery maids at the very bottom of the indoor hierarchy, who washed dishes and scrubbed pots until their hands were raw. And that's just inside the house. Outside, you had an entirely separate kingdom. The head gardener, who might command a team of 10 or 15 men. At Welbeck Abbey, during certain periods, there were 65 full-time gardeners, 65 people just to maintain the grounds. You had grooms and stable boys, sometimes as young as 10 years old, caring for the horses. Coachman, a gamekeeper, whose job was to maintain the bird population so the master could host hunting parties. Groundskeepers, a gatekeeper. In some of the largest estates, if you counted every single person on the payroll, from the house steward down to the youngest scullery maid, you might find 150 people. 150 human lives, all rotating around the needs and whims of a single family. Now, here's what really strikes me about this. These servants weren't just workers clocking in and out. They lived there, they ate there, they slept there. Their entire lives unfolded within the walls and grounds of these estates. For many, especially those who started young, and remember, some were just children, 10 or 11 years old, the estate was the only world they knew. And here's the strangest part. There was a weird kind of pride in it. Many servants came from families who had served the same estate for generations. Your grandfather was a groom, your father was a groom, so you became a groom. Your mother was a housemaid, your grandmother before her, so that's what you did too. There was an emotional investment in these places. Some servants genuinely felt that the house belonged to them as much as it did to the family. They took pride in keeping it running, in maintaining standards, in being part of something grand. But let's be honest about what this system really was. It was a machine, a human machine designed to create the illusion of effortless luxury. When the lady of the house woke up in her four-poster bed, she didn't think about the housemaid who had crept into her room at 5 a.m. to light the fire so the room would be warm. She didn't think about the person who had quietly removed her chamber pot, or the one who had drawn her bath water, heated by someone else in the basement and carried up multiple flights of stairs in heavy copper cans. When the family sat down to breakfast, perfectly prepared and laid out on fine china, they didn't think about the cook who'd been up since 4:30, or the scullery maid who'd already scrubbed a dozen pots, or the kitchen maid who'd prepared the ingredients. The food simply appeared. Like magic. This was the goal. Invisible service. The servants were everywhere and nowhere. They moved through hidden corridors, used back staircases that the family never saw, appeared when summoned by those bells we'll talk about later, and vanished the moment their task was complete. And the numbers required to maintain this illusion were staggering. Think about it practically. In a world without washing machines, without dishwashers, without vacuum cleaners, without electric lights or central heating or any of the conveniences we take for granted, everything required human labour. Every single thing, Want a fire in your bedroom? Someone has to carry coal up the stairs, clean out yesterday's ashes, lay new kindling, light it and tend it throughout the day. Want a hot bath? Someone has to heat the water, carry it up in cans, pour it, then carry it all back down again afterward. Want your clothes clean? Someone has to haul water, heat it, scrub every item by hand, wring it out, hang it to dry, heat irons on the stove and press everything until it's perfect. Multiply that by the 10 or 15 family members, plus guests, because these houses frequently had guests. You start to understand why you needed so many people. But here's what really gets me. The family knew these people existed, of course, they saw them every day, but there was this strange psychological trick happening. The servants were trained to be so unobtrusive, so quiet, so efficient that they became almost like furniture. Background elements. The family could have entire conversations in front of them as if they weren't there, could discuss private matters, family secrets, romantic affairs, financial troubles, all within earshot of people who were simply expected to forget everything they heard. Can you imagine that? Spending your entire day surrounded by people who look right through you? And yet, within their own world, the servants' hall, the kitchen, their quarters, these invisible people had their own dramas, their own hierarchies, their own complicated relationships. The butler might have the same authority in his domain as the master had in his. The housekeeper was every bit as formidable as the lady of the house. The servants' hall had its own strict rules about who sat where, who spoke when, who deserved respect and who didn't. At Erdig Estate in Wales, there's a photograph from 1912 that I find incredibly moving. It shows the entire staff lined up: gardeners, housemaids, footmen, butler, cook, laundress, housekeeper, and the estate foreman. About 20 people in total, a modest household by the grand estate standards. But look at their faces in that photograph and you see real people. A young kitchen maid, maybe 17, looking slightly uncertain. An older gardener with weathered hands and a proud expression. The housekeeper, stern and unsmiling, clearly someone not to be trifled with. These were individuals with hopes and dreams and personalities and problems, all compressed into a system that required them to function as a single, silent, invisible organism. And the truly wild thing? This system worked. It worked so well that it lasted for centuries. It worked so well that families came to absolutely depend on it, couldn't imagine life without it. It worked so well that when it finally started to collapse in the early 1900s, when the world changed and servants became harder to find and more expensive to keep, these grand estates began to crumble too. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now we're still in the height of this era. The bells are ringing. The kitchen is hot and chaotic. The housemaids are moving silently through the upper floors. The footmen are standing at attention. And somewhere, probably in the game larder, another chicken is being prepared to rotate on that spit at Welbeck Abbey, just in case the Duke gets hungry. This was the invisible army. 50 to 100 people, sometimes more, each a cog in an enormous machine designed to create the fantasy of effortless aristocratic life. And the truly strange part? Most of the world never gave them a second thought. They were just there, always there, like the wallpaper, like the paintings on the walls, but they were people, real people. And in the coming parts of our journey, we're going to walk in their shoes. We're going to see what they saw, feel what they felt, understand what their lives were really like behind all that invisible efficiency. Because that's the thing about invisibility. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't real. And these servants, these hundreds of thousands of people across Britain who spent their lives in service, their stories are as real and as fascinating as any tale of lords and ladies in their grand drawing rooms. Maybe more so. Because while the family upstairs lived in luxury, it was the people downstairs who made it all possible. They were the foundation, the engine, the beating heart of these grand estates. And their story, their real story, is only just beginning. So as we prepare to descend those narrow back stairs, to enter the hidden corridors and cramped quarters where this invisible army actually lived, I want you to remember something. Every time you see a period drama, every time you watch a show about grand country houses and elegant dinner parties, every time you admire the beauty of these estates, there were dozens of people you're not seeing. People working in the shadows, people who made all that beauty possible, and now, finally, we're going to bring them into the light. We're going to step through that servant's entrance and discover a world that was always there, just beyond the edges of the frame. A world of strict hierarchies and endless labour, of pride and resentment, of dreams deferred and lives lived in service to others. A world that was, in its own strange way, just as complex and dramatic as anything happening upstairs. In our next part, we're going underground. Literally. We're going to explore the secret architecture that made this invisible service possible. The hidden staircases, the underground tunnels, the cramped sleeping quarters tucked into attics and basements. We're going to see how these grand houses were designed not just for beauty, but for segregation, for keeping the working world separate from the leisured one. And trust me, some of what we discover down there is going to surprise you, because the architecture itself tells a story about what the Victorians really believed, really valued, really feared. So stay with me. Our journey through the servants' world is just beginning. You know what's fascinating? When you visit these grand estates today, places like Chatsworth or Blenheim Palace, you walk through room after magnificent room, admiring the artwork, the furniture, the soaring ceilings, but what you're seeing is only half the house, sometimes less than half, because beneath your feet, behind the walls you're looking at, above the ceilings you're admiring, there's an entire hidden world. A secret architecture that most visitors to these houses never knew existed. Let me take you there now. Imagine you're standing in the grand entrance hall of Eastbury Manor House in the late 1800s. Marble floors, a sweeping staircase with an ornate balustrade curving up to the family bedrooms, paintings of ancestors staring down at you. Everything designed to impress, to inspire awe. But now, look to your right. See that door? The one that's smaller, plainer, almost designed to be overlooked. That's where the real architecture begins. Push open that door and you enter a completely different universe. The temperature drops. These back corridors weren't heated. The ceilings are lower. The walls are plain plaster, no wallpaper, no decoration. And most striking of all, the stairs. Not the grand, sweeping staircase you just saw, but tight, narrow, circular stairs. Back stairs, they called them. And these stairs tell you everything you need to know about how Victorians viewed their servants. You see, these stairs were designed for speed and efficiency, not comfort. They spiral tightly, so tightly that you have to watch your head on every turn. Try carrying a heavy coal scuttle up these stairs. Try balancing a tray of breakfast dishes. Try doing it quickly because the bell just rang and someone upstairs is waiting. Now try doing it invisibly, because if the family sees you using their main staircase, you could be reprimanded or even dismissed. At Eastbury, if you study the original floor plans, and yes, many of these still exist in estate archives, you can see exactly how the architects thought about this division. The family's grand staircase occupies the centre of the house, wide and welcoming. But tucked into the right side, almost as an afterthought, is this tight spiral of servant stairs. Two completely separate circulation systems, two different classes of people never meant to intersect. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some estates took this separation to extraordinary lengths. They built entire hidden corridors, secret passageways, underground tunnels. There's an estate called Carton House in Maynooth, County Kildare in Ireland. and someone who actually lived in the steward's house there in the 20th century described something remarkable. Beneath the main house, there was a long tunnel. This wasn't a small passage. It was substantial enough for servants to walk through, carrying supplies, moving from one end of the massive house to the other. And here's the thing, it had no windows, none, zero natural light. Servants who worked down there spent their entire day in artificial lamplight or, later, dim electric bulbs, moving through this underground network like some kind of human subway system. Why? So they wouldn't be seen. So the family could look out their windows at the pristine grounds without the unpleasant sight of servants scurrying about. So guests arriving at the front entrance wouldn't encounter someone carrying dirty laundry or yesterday's chamber pots. And some servants actually lived down there, slept in rooms carved into the basement level, entered only through these tunnels. Try to picture that for a moment. You wake up in a room with no window. You work all day in corridors with no natural light. And if you're lucky, maybe you get an hour or two outside on your half day off each month. Now you might think these tunnels were unusual, but they weren't. Waddesdon Manor has them. Mentmore Towers has them. Multiple estates across Britain designed these elaborate systems to keep servants out of sight. It was architectural apartheid, really. Two worlds, one visible and one invisible, existing in the same physical space but never meant to touch. Let's talk about sleeping arrangements, because this reveals even more about the mindset. Where did these invisible workers sleep? In the attic or in the basement? The two extremes of the house, the hottest rooms in summer, the coldest in winter, the rooms furthest from everything. Female servants, housemaids, chambermaids, laundry maids were almost always housed in the attic, and I'm not talking about charming converted loft spaces with skylights. I'm talking about tiny rooms tucked under the eaves with sloping ceilings so low you couldn't stand up straight. Small windows, if any, minimal furniture. At Lanhydrock in Cornwall you can still see these rooms today preserved exactly as they were in the late 1800s. The maid's bedroom has a narrow iron bed, a simple wooden chair, a small chest of drawers, and that's it. Maybe 6 feet by 8 feet of space. And this was for one person if they were lucky. In many houses, maids shared rooms, 2 or 3 to a space barely larger than this. But here's the really clever, or cruel, depending on how you look at it, architectural detail. The housekeeper's room was positioned at the end of the female servants' corridor. Why? To monitor them, to ensure no inappropriate behaviour, to maintain discipline. The housekeeper could hear every footstep, every whispered conversation, every movement. Privacy was not a concept that applied to servants. And the male servants? They got the basement. Cold, damp, often partially underground. The butler's quarters were positioned next to the strong room where the valuable silver was kept. Because, of course, even in sleep he was on duty, guarding the family's treasures. Footmen, grooms, other male servants were scattered around the basement level, in rooms that were barely habitable by modern standards. Here's something that really struck me when I learned about it. At many estates, the architects actually built curved corners into the basement corridors. You know why? So servants moving quickly, and they were always moving quickly, wouldn't injure themselves bumping into sharp corners in the dim light. Think about that. They designed the architecture assuming servants would be running, rushing, constantly in motion. These curves weren't for aesthetics. They were for efficiency, for preventing injuries that would slow down the human machine. The Regency townhouse in Brighton gives you a perfect example of this basement world. The walls are plain plaster with these distinctive curved corners. The floors are original stone flags, cold, hard, unforgiving. The only light came from small windows at ground level and tallow candles or oil lamps. Combine that with the coal fires they used for heating and cooking, and the whole basement level was perpetually smoky, dim, and probably smelled pretty terrible. And if you think the sleeping quarters were bad, let me tell you about the toilet situation, because this is where the class divide becomes almost comically cruel. Upstairs by the Victorian era, wealthy families were installing the latest technology, flush toilets, or water closets as they were called. Porcelain bowls running water, the height of modern convenience. But downstairs, the servants got a privy, an outdoor non-flushing toilet. At the Regency townhouse, this was located in the courtyard. So in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, if you needed to go, you had to leave the building and walk outside to this little shed. And it gets better. The contents of these privies were collected regularly by people called night soil men, who had carted away to be sold as manure. Imagine being a maid or a footman living in a grand house worth millions in today's money, surrounded by luxury and wealth, but having to use the same toilet system as a medieval peasant. Now, let's talk about how this architectural segregation was enforced on an even larger scale in country estates. Because in rural settings, where space wasn't an issue, the Victorians got really creative with hiding their servants. At estates like Waddesdon Manor, built in the 1880s, the service wings were deliberately hidden behind screens of trees, shrubs, and landscaped earth banks. From the main house and gardens, you couldn't see them at all. The servants' quarters were designed to be light and airy inside. The Victorians weren't complete monsters, but the windows deliberately faced away from the principal areas of the house. Think about the symbolism of that. The servants could look out their windows, sure, but only at walls or service yards or the backs of other buildings, never at the beautiful gardens, never at the scenic views. Those were reserved for the family. In towns where space was limited, this became even more challenging. The solution? Multi-level segregation. The Victorians became masters of the vertical divide. Take a typical London townhouse from the 1800s. The family lived on the ground floor and first floor, the piano nobile as it was called in architectural terms. The servants worked primarily in the basement and slept in the attic. Same building, but they might as well have been living in different countries. And the connection between these levels? Minimal. Often a single door lined with green baize fabric. You know what green baize is? It's that felt-like material they use on pool tables. And they lined doors with it for one specific reason, soundproofing. So the family wouldn't hear the noise from the kitchen, wouldn't hear the servants talking, the pots clanging, the chaos of running a household. The door absorbed the sound, made the servants even more invisible, not just visually, but orally. Some of these passageways from kitchen to dining room were absurdly long. Architects designed tortuous routes through corridors and upstairs, sometimes covering an eighth of a mile. An eighth of a mile! That's more than 200 yards. Imagine being a footman, carrying a heavy silver tureen of soup that's supposed to be piping hot, navigating stairs and turns and corridors for more than 200 yards. By the time you reached the dining room, the soup would be lukewarm at best. But you know what was more important than hot food? The absence of cooking smells in the family's living areas. That was the priority. The family's comfort, their refined sensibilities, trumped basic practicality every single time. Now, here's something I find particularly telling about Victorian architecture. They didn't just separate servants from family. They separated male servants from female servants with almost paranoid intensity. This obsession came from Victorian ideas about propriety and virtue. The great country house was supposed to represent moral order, Christian values, the protection of female virtue, so the architecture reflected that. At many estates, male and female servants had completely separate staircases, separate corridors. Their quarters were deliberately placed on opposite sides or ends of the house. Some estates even had what they called a gentleman's staircase separate from the main family staircase, which itself was separate from the servants' stairs. 3 different staircases in one house. 3 different circulatory systems, all to maintain proper separation of the sexes and classes. The architects actually published books about this. Robert Kerr, one of the most influential architectural writers of the Victorian era, wrote extensively about the gentleman's house. He identified what he called essential characteristics: privacy, comfort, convenience, health, elegance, and, this is interesting, importance and ornamentation. The house had to look impressive, had to display wealth, had to make a statement. But buried in his writings, he also talks about the need for separate servants' quarters, for service wings that don't disturb the aesthetic of the main house, for systems that allow servants to work without being seen or heard. The architecture of invisibility was deliberate, planned, refined over decades. You know what this reminds me of? Have you ever been backstage at a theatre? There's this whole hidden world behind the curtain. Narrow corridors, harsh lighting, exposed pipes and wires, people rushing around in costume. But from the audience you see none of that. You see only the beautiful set. The perfect lighting, the seamless performance, that's exactly what these grand estates were. Elaborate theatrical productions. The family and guests were the audience, the servants were the stagehands, working furiously behind the scenes to maintain the illusion. And just like in a theatre, the backstage areas were purely functional. No one cared if they were beautiful. No one cared if they were comfortable. They just had to work. At Bearwood, one of the grandest Victorian country houses, the service area was enormous. If you look at the floor plans, you can identify separate spaces for cooking, laundry, pantries, storage and accommodations for the head of each service department. The head cook had her own quarters, the head laundress had hers, the housekeeper had her sitting room and bedroom. It was like a small village, all designed around service. And here's something that really brings this home for me. At many of these estates, the servants' quarters and service areas actually occupied more square footage than the family's living spaces. More space. But you'd never know it from looking at the house, because all that space was hidden, tucked away, designed to be invisible. There's a profound sadness in that, don't you think? All these people, all this labour, all this human life happening in spaces deliberately designed to be overlooked. They lived their entire lives in the shadows of these grand houses, moving through corridors the family never saw, sleeping in rooms the family never entered, existing in a parallel world that was absolutely essential but completely unacknowledged. And the architecture, this brilliant, calculated, deliberately designed architecture, made it all possible. It turned human beings into ghosts, present but unseen, working but unheard, essential but invisible. So the next time you see a photograph of a grand country house with its perfect symmetry and beautiful proportions, remember this: what you're seeing is a facade. Behind it, beside it, beneath it, there's another house entirely. A house of narrow corridors and steep stairs, of cold bedrooms and smoky basements, of doors lined with green bays and windows that face nowhere. That's the architecture of service, the architecture of invisibility, and once you know it's there, you can never unsee it. In our next part, we're going to talk about one of the most ingenious and tyrannical pieces of Victorian technology ever invented. Something that connected every room of the house to the servants' quarters, that could summon a maid from her bedroom in the middle of the night, that rang constantly from dawn until well past midnight. We're going to explore the bell system. And trust me, once you understand how it worked and what it meant for the people who had to answer those bells, you'll never watch a period drama the same way again. Stay with me. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this sound. A sharp metallic jangle, then another from a different direction, overlapping, insistent, demanding immediate attention. Now imagine that sound is your entire life. From the moment you wake up until the moment you collapse into bed at night, that sound controls when you move, where you go, what you do. That sound is your master. Welcome to the world of the Victorian servant bell system. The year is 1744. Someone, somewhere in England, history hasn't preserved their name unfortunately, invents something that will fundamentally change the relationship between masters and servants. It's a simple mechanism really, a wire, a spring, a bell, but the implications, revolutionary. Before this invention, if you were wealthy and needed something from a servant, you had a problem. You could shout, but that wasn't dignified. You could go find them yourself, but that defeated the entire purpose of having servants. Or, and this is what most people did, you could have servants just standing around waiting, literally standing in corridors, lurking in corners, hovering near doorways just in case you needed something. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that must have been for everyone involved? The servant standing there for hours, trying to look attentive but not intrusive. The family trying to have private conversations with someone perpetually in earshot. It was inefficient and awkward. So when this bell system was invented, it must have seemed like magic. Pull a cord in your bedroom, and somewhere downstairs a bell rings. A servant sees which bell it is, comes to your room, and you tell them what you need. Privacy maintained, efficiency achieved. Perfect, except, of course, if you were the one answering the bells. Let me explain how these systems actually worked, because the engineering was genuinely impressive, even if the purpose was somewhat sinister. In each main room of the house, bedrooms, drawing rooms, dining room, library, morning room, you name it, there was a pull. These weren't simple ropes. The earliest versions were often beautifully crafted strips of embroidered cloth or tapestry, ending in a decorative tassel or ring. In bedrooms, there were usually 2 pulls, one on each side of the bed so you could summon help without even getting up. Imagine being so accustomed to service that you couldn't even sit up in bed without assistance being immediately available. These pulls were connected to wires, tensioned cables really, that ran through the house. Under floorboards, behind skirting boards, through walls. In a large estate there might be miles of wire threading through the building like a nervous system. The wires had to go around corners, up and down floors, so there were special brackets and tubes to guide them. You can still find these in old houses today, these little metal fixtures that once carried commands from upstairs to down. The wires led to a bellboard, usually mounted high on a wall in a corridor near the servants' quarters. And here's where it gets clever. Each bell hung from a coiled spring. When you pulled the cord upstairs, the wire pulled the bell which rang, but here's the brilliant part. The spring kept a pendulum swinging even after the bell stopped making noise. Why? Because servants might not be standing right there when the bell rang. They might be in the kitchen, or the scullery, or the laundry room, so they needed a visual indicator. They'd hear bells ringing somewhere, rush to the bellboard, and see which pendulum was still swinging. Ah, the morning room. Off they'd go. The bells themselves were different sizes and made different tones. Experienced servants could identify which room was calling just by the sound, without even looking at the board. A deep clang meant the master's bedroom. A higher pitch meant the blue guest room. A particular resonance meant the library. It was like learning a musical language, except instead of creating beauty, you were responding to demands. Each bell was labelled, of course, small brass plaques underneath. Master bedroom, drawing room, ladies' chamber, nursery. And here's a detail I love. These labels could be repainted or changed, as the use of rooms changed. So if the blue bedroom became the yellow bedroom, or if a new wing was added, the system could be updated. Very practical. The handles of the pulls themselves were often decorative. Remember, these were in the family's spaces, so they had to look nice. They might be made of brass, porcelain, china, or cut glass. Some were genuine works of art. Imagine the irony. A beautiful object whose sole purpose was to summon someone to serve you. Now, if you're thinking this sounds demanding but manageable, let me tell you about the reality of living with these bells. The bells rang constantly. From around 6 in the morning until past midnight. Think about a typical day in a grand house. The family wakes up, bells ring for hot water, for tea, for help dressing. Breakfast time, bells for stivis. Morning activities, more bells. Luncheon, bells. Afternoon tea, bells. Dinner preparation, bells. Evening entertainment, bells. Bedtime, bells for help undressing, for warming beds, for one last request. And that's just the routine. Add in guests, and remember these houses frequently had guests staying for days or weeks, and the bell ringing intensified dramatically. Each guest had their own set of needs, their own schedule, their own demands. There are cartoons from the Victorian era that show the frustration this caused. One famous illustration from 1805, held in the Library of Congress, shows guests at a dinner party absolutely shocked because the lady of the house stood up to ring the bell herself. The scandal. The horror. A lady exerting herself. The image is played for laughs, but it reveals something real. Pulling your own bell was seen as somehow beneath dignity, and the speed of response became a matter of pride and competition. How quickly could your servants answer? In some households, there were actual complaints dogged about response times. Too slow, and you might face discipline from the butler or housekeeper, or worse, dismissal. Think about the psychological impact of this. You're a young housemaid, maybe 16 years old. You're in the middle of scrubbing a floor, hands raw, back aching. The bell rings. You have to drop everything, make yourself presentable, rush through those narrow corridors we talked about earlier, climb stairs, and appear in the room looking calm and ready to serve, and you have no idea what they want. Maybe it's something simple, close the curtains. Maybe it's something time-consuming, prepare a bath, which means hauling water. You won't know until you get there. And here's the thing that really gets me. The bell doesn't care what you're doing. It doesn't care if you're eating your own meal. It doesn't care if you're exhausted. It doesn't care if you're sick. When it rings, you go. That's the job. At Whitewick Manor in Wolverhampton, they later installed an electric bell system. These started appearing in the 1860s, made possible by the invention of the battery. The mechanism was different. An electromagnet, an armature, a small hammer striking the bell. But the principle was the same. Actually, it was worse because electric bells were easier to ring. Just press a button. No need to exert yourself pulling a cord. The servant side of an electric system had an indicator board. A shallow glass-fronted case with small named apertures. When someone pressed a button upstairs, a bell rang near the board and a coloured disc moved behind the appropriate aperture. Very modern, very efficient, very relentless, because here's what these systems really represented. The mechanization of human attention. The family could summon help with the effort of pulling a cord or pressing a button. The servants had to respond with the effort of their entire bodies, moving through the house, climbing stairs, performing tasks. There's an estate called Tredegar House in Wales, where an entire wing was converted into servants' quarters in the 18th century. The bell board there had dozens of bells. Dozens. Each one representing a different room, a different potential summons, and servants learned to live in a state of perpetual alertness, always listening for that jangle. Can you imagine what that does to your nervous system over time? To always be on call? To never fully relax because at any moment a bell might ring, and it wasn't just during waking hours. Night bells were a special torture. If someone rang from a bedroom in the middle of the night, a servant had to wake up, make themselves presentable and respond. Maybe the master couldn't sleep and wanted warm milk. Maybe a guest needed an extra blanket. Maybe someone just wanted to know what time it was. And the servant would have been sleeping in that cold attic room or damp basement we talked about, so they'd have to navigate dark corridors, probably with just a candle to find out what was needed. The National Trust has done amazing work preserving these bell systems in estates across Britain. At Lanhydrock in Cornwall, you can see the bell board as it was in the late 1800s, at Belton House, at Erdig, at dozens of other properties. And when you stand there and look at all those bells lined up, you start to understand the scale of surveillance this represented. Because that's what it was really, a surveillance system. The family could monitor the servant's responsiveness. The butler and housekeeper could monitor who was quick and who was slow. Everyone was watching, judging, measuring, and the bells kept ringing. Now, I mentioned earlier that this system was invented in 1744, but it really exploded in popularity during the Victorian era. Why? Because the middle class was expanding, more people had money, more people wanted to appear respectable, refined, upper class. And nothing said I've made it quite like having servants you could summon with bells. Even modest middle-class homes started installing these systems. A small townhouse might have just a few bells, but they had them. It became a status symbol. The sound of bells ringing in your house meant you had servants, and having servants meant you'd achieve something. Property developers caught on fast. By the late Victorian period, even semi-detached villas were being built with wire already installed in the walls. You could order your bell system from catalogues full of different styles and prices. It was like shopping for doorknobs or light fixtures. Pick your pulls, pick your bells, install the system, instant respectability. And this is fascinating. The late Victorians probably had a wider choice of consumer goods than any generation until the internet age. You could browse through massive catalogues and choose from hundreds of options for your bell system. Fancy brass, simple iron, decorative porcelain, it was all available at various price points. But as technology advanced, mechanical bells started to be replaced by electric systems. By the late 1800s, electric bells with indicator boxes and flags were becoming common in wealthier households. The wires were simpler to install, the buttons were easier to use, and from the family's perspective, it was all very modern and convenient. From the servant's perspective, it just meant the bells rang more often. There's something darkly comedic about the whole thing, isn't there? All this engineering brilliance, all this innovation, all this money spent, and for what? So wealthy people could avoid the minor inconvenience of raising their voice or walking down a hallway, so they could maintain the fiction that servants simply appeared when needed and vanished when not, summoned by magic rather than by human effort. I sometimes wonder what archaeologists thousands of years from now will make of these systems if they dig up these houses. All these wires, all these bells, all this infrastructure. Will they understand it was a technology of control, of convenience for some purchased with constant vigilance from others? Here's something that really drives this home. There's a report from London during an earthquake in 1750. An English earl described the chaos. And do you know what he mentioned? The sound of all the servant bells ringing at once from the tremor. That's what stuck in his mind. Not just the earthquake itself, but all those bells jangling together, creating a cacophony of summons. That image haunts me. All those bells ringing, servants running in every direction, confused, trying to figure out what was real and what was caused by the earthquake. The system that controlled their lives turned into chaos for just a moment. And yet, despite all of this, the constant demands, the lack of privacy, the perpetual on-call status, the system worked. It worked for over a century. Millions of servants in thousands of households responded to those bells day after day, year after year. Why? Well, that's complicated. For some, it was the only work available. For others, service in a grand house was actually a step up from farm labour or factory work. You got room and board, hand-me-down clothes, maybe some tips from guests, and there was a strange kind of pride in working for an important family, in being part of a prestigious household. But I can't help thinking about the cost. The mental cost of never being off duty, the physical cost of constantly rushing through the house, the emotional cost of being reduced to a function, summoned by a bell like a trained animal. The bell systems are quiet now in most of these houses. Museums preserve them as historical curiosities. Visitors look at them and maybe imagine how they worked. But they don't hear them ringing. They don't feel that jolt of adrenaline when the bell jangles. They don't know the weight of a life lived in response to that sound. But now you do. Now when you see one of these bellboards in a museum or a preserved estate, you'll understand what it really represents. Not just Victorian ingenuity, but Victorian priorities. Not just a communication system, but a control system. Not just bells, but the sound of an entire class of people being summoned, constantly, relentlessly, day after day after day. So we've explored the architecture that hid servants, and the technology that controlled them. But who were these people actually? What was their daily life like? In our next part, we're going to follow a specific person, a housemaid, through an actual day of work, hour by hour, task by task, bell by bell. And I have to warn you, it's exhausting just to describe, but it's important, because these weren't just functions or roles. They were people with real lives lived in service to others. Let's meet one of them. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Mary. She's 17 years old, though she looks older. Hard work will do that to you. She's been a housemaid at a country estate in Derbyshire for 2 years now, having started when she was just 15, and we're going to spend an entire day with her. Every hour, every task, every moment, because the only way to truly understand what servant life was like is to live it, minute by minute. Are you ready? Because Mary's day starts in about 4 hours, and she needs whatever sleep she can get. It's 5:45 in the morning, still dark outside, winter in England, so the sun won't rise for another hour and a half. Mary's attic room is freezing, there's no heat up here, and frost has formed on the inside of the small window. She sleeps in her chemise and stockings because it's too cold to do otherwise. Her body wakes before the clock. After 2 years, she's learned to wake herself at this exact time. If she's late, there will be consequences. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, keeps a mental tally of every infraction, and 3 late mornings could mean dismissal without a reference. And without a reference, finding another position would be nearly impossible. Mary sits up in the narrow iron bed, her breath visible in the frigid air, lights a candle, her only source of light at this hour, gets dressed quickly, the same black dress she wears every day, patched in places but clean. White apron, white cap. Her hands are already rough and reddened from work, and she's only 17. By the time she's 30, if she's still in service, they'll be worse. 6 o'clock. She's downstairs now in the servants' hall, where she gulps down a quick breakfast. Bread, maybe some dripping spread on it if they're lucky. Weak tea. There's no time to linger. The other maids are there too. Jana, the head housemaid, who's been here for 8 years and rules the maids with an iron fist. Sarah, the scullery maid, who's only 13 and looks terrified most time. And Ellen, the chambermaid, who's kind but exhausted. Always exhausted. 6:15. The real work begins. Mary's first task is the fireplaces. There are 12 fireplaces in the family's part of the house, and each one needs to be cleaned, laid with fresh kindling and coal and lit before the family wakes. But here's the trick. She has to do this silently, invisibly. If anyone upstairs hears her, if anyone wakes because of the noise, she'll be in trouble. So picture this. Mary kneels on the cold hearth of the drawing-room fireplace. She has a small brush, a bucket for ashes, a scuttle of coal. She starts by carefully removing yesterday's ashes. The grate is still slightly warm, which helps, but it's also dirty work. The ash gets everywhere, on her apron, on her hands, in her hair. She has to be meticulous because any ash left behind will affect how today's fire burns. Then she lays the new fire. Crumpled newspaper first, then kindling arranged just so, then small pieces of coal, then larger pieces. It's an art, actually. Lay it wrong and the fire won't catch properly. Will smoke instead of burning clean, and then she'll have to start over while someone complains about the cold. She lights it carefully, watches to make sure it catches. Good. 1 down, 11 to go. By 7 o'clock, she's finished all 12 fireplaces. Her knees ache from kneeling. Her hands are black with coal dust. But there's no time to clean up yet because now she has to dust and sweep the main rooms before the family comes down for breakfast. Have you ever tried to sweep a carpet without making noise? It's harder than it sounds. The carpet sweeper they use, a mechanical device with brushes, works well enough, but you have to push it slowly, carefully to avoid that loud swishing sound. And you have to get into corners, under furniture, along baseboards. Everything must be perfect. Mary works her way through the morning room, the drawing room, the library. She dusts every surface, mantelpieces, side tables, picture frames, the countless decorative objects the family has accumulated. She has to be careful, break something and the cost could be deducted from her wages. She earns £12 a year, about £1 per month, and a broken vase could cost her a month's salary. By 7:30 the work is interrupted by a bell. Someone's awake upstairs. Mary stops mid-sweep, checks which bell is ringing. The mistress's bedroom. Of course, the lady of the house wakes early. Mary has to put down her cleaning supplies, make sure her apron is straight, tuck any loose hair under her cap, and hurry upstairs via the back stairs. She knocks softly on the bedroom door, enters when called. "Good morning, ma'am, you rang?" The mistress wants the curtains opened and hot water brought up for washing. Mary opens the heavy velvet curtains, letting in the grey morning light, then hurries back downstairs to the kitchen. The kitchen is chaos at this hour. The cook and kitchen maids preparing breakfast, steam rising from pots, the range radiating heat. It's actually pleasant after the cold of the rest of the house. Mary fills a large copper can with hot water from the tank beside the range. The can is heavy and awkward, and she has to carry it carefully up 3 flights of stairs without spilling. By the time she reaches the mistress's bedroom again, her arms are trembling. She pours the water into the washing basin, arranges the towels, and withdraws. The whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes, but it interrupted her cleaning schedule. Now she has to hurry to finish before the family comes down for breakfast at 8:30. 8 o'clock. Mary is back to sweeping and dusting, but her mind is also on the next task. She'll need to help strip and make beds soon, and there are 8 bedrooms in use right now because the family has guests. 8:30. The family comes down for breakfast. Mary must make herself scarce. Lower servants are not supposed to be visible when the family is in a room, so she retreats to the servants' areas, waiting for the breakfast service to finish upstairs so she can begin the next round of tasks. 9 o'clock. Breakfast is over. Now comes one of the most physically demanding parts of Mary's day, the bedrooms. She teams up with Ellen, the chambermaid, and they start with the guest bedrooms. First, they strip the beds. And these aren't simple beds like we have today. These are massive Victorian beds with multiple layers, sheets, blankets, counterpanes, quilts. Everything has to be removed, shaken out, and either replaced or aired. Chamber pots have to be emptied and cleaned. Yes, chamber pots. Even though the house has some flush toilets, many bedrooms still use chamber pots during the night. Mary and Ellen have to carry these carefully down the back stairs to the water closet, empty them, scrub them clean and return them to the bedrooms. It's degrading work, but it has to be done. Then they make the beds. Fresh sheets if it's a Monday sheet-changing day, or the same sheets smoothed and tucked if it's midweek. Hospital corners, perfectly smooth surfaces, pillows fluffed just right. The mistress inspects rooms randomly, and woe to any maid whose bed-making doesn't meet her standards. While making beds, they also dust the bedroom furniture, sweep the floors, empty and clean the wash basins, refill water pitchers, arrange towels, check that there's fresh soap, make sure the fire is burning properly, and generally ensure that when the family or guests return to their rooms, everything is perfect. This takes hours. By noon, Mary and Ellen have finished 6 of the 8 bedrooms. They are both exhausted, hands raw from wringing out washing cloths, backs aching from bending over the beds and reaching under furniture. 12:30, servants' dinner. This is the main meal for the servants, eaten in the servants' hall. It's a formal affair and Mary hates it. Everyone sits in order of rank. The butler and housekeeper at the head of the table, upper servants like the lady's maid and valet next, then the regular housemaids and footmen, then the lowly scullery maid at the far end. The butler says grace, then the meal begins, and it's eaten in near silence. The butler monitors everything. Who takes too much food, who speaks out of turn, who shows poor table manners. It's supposed to be a break, but it feels like another form of work. Mary eats quickly. Bread, some cold meat, vegetables, weak beer, always aware of Mrs. Thornton's disapproving gaze. 1 o'clock. After the main meal, the upper servants, butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, valet, retire to the housekeeper's room for dessert and wine. The lower servants remain in the servants' hall, and finally there's a moment to breathe. The conversation loosens up. Sarah, the young scullery maid, tells a joke and everyone laughs, though they keep their voices down. But this break lasts maybe 20 minutes. By 1:30, everyone is back to work. Mary's afternoon tasks vary by day. Today is Tuesday, which means polishing. The silver needs attention. There are dozens of pieces, candlesticks, serving platters, tea services, cutlery. Mary works alongside a footman named Thomas in the butler's pantry using polish that smells sharp and chemical, rubbing each piece until it shines. Her hands, already rough from the morning's work, sting from the polish, but the silver must gleam. The family's having a dinner party tonight, and everything must be perfect. 3 o'clock, a bell rings. The drawing room. One of the guests wants tea brought up. Mary has to stop polishing, wash her hands quickly, and help the footman prepare and carry up the tea service. They arrange it on the table in the drawing room. Fine china, delicate cakes, tiny sandwiches that the cook has prepared. The guest barely glances at them as they set everything out. Back downstairs, more polishing. By 4 o'clock, Mary's fingers are cramping, but she's only halfway through the silver that needs to be ready for tonight's dinner. 5 o'clock, the pace intensifies. The dinner party is at 8, which means the next 3 hours are going to be frantic. The dining room has to be prepared. Mary helps set the table under the butler's exacting supervision. Crisp white tablecloth. Place settings precisely measured. Each fork, knife and spoon exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table. Crystal glasses positioned just so. Flowers arranged as a centerpiece. Candles in the silver candlestick she polished earlier. 6 o'clock, the family and guests are dressing for dinner. This is when the lady's maid and valet earn their keep, helping their employers navigate the complicated business of Victorian formal wear. Mary, meanwhile, is still working. She has to make sure the drawing room is perfect for pre-dinner drinks, check that all the fires are burning properly, and stand by in case she's needed for last-minute tasks. 7 o'clock, a brief window to eat something. The servants grab supper, usually leftovers or simple cold food. Mary eats standing up in the kitchen, too tired to care what it tastes like. 7:30. Everyone is on high alert now. The guests are gathering in the drawing room. Dinner will be served at 8 precisely. Mary's role during dinner is to stay out of sight but nearby, ready if a bell rings, ready if something is needed. 8 o'clock. Dinner begins upstairs. The footmen serve, moving in and out of the dining room with practiced precision. Mary waits in the corridor, listening to the muted sounds of conversation and laughter. She's been working for 14 hours straight, and she won't be finished for another 4 at least. 9:30. Dinner ends. The ladies retire to the drawing room, the gentlemen to the library for port and cigars. Mary and the other maids swoop in to help clear the dining room. Mountains of dishes, glasses, serving platters. All of this goes down to the scullery where Sarah, poor Sarah, will wash everything. But Mary's work isn't done. She has to prepare the bedrooms for the night. Turn down the beds, folding back the covers in a specific way. Close the curtains, make sure the chamber pots are clean and accessible. Ensure there's fresh water for washing. Light the bedroom fires if they've gone out. 10:30. The guests begin retiring to their rooms. Mary has to be available in case anyone needs anything. A guest can't find her nightgown. Another wants an extra blanket. Someone's fire is smoking. Each request means Mary has to stop what she's doing, attend to the need, then resume. 11 o'clock. The house is finally quiet. The family and guests are in their rooms. But Mary still isn't done. She has to help tidy the drawing room and library, make sure all the fires are banked for the night, check that doors are locked. 11:30. She's climbing the stairs to her attic room, candle in hand, so tired she can barely think. She peels off her dress and apron, not bothering to wash, she's too exhausted, and the water up here would be ice cold anyway. Midnight. Mary lies down in her narrow bed, in her freezing attic room, and within minutes she's asleep. In 5 hours and 45 minutes she'll wake and do it all again. 18 hours of work, 18 hours of kneeling and scrubbing and carrying and cleaning and waiting and serving. And this was a typical day, not an unusually hard one, just normal. Do you understand now? This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of young women across Britain. This grinding, relentless, exhausting labour, day after day after day, for wages that amounted to £1 a month, for a small room and basic food, for the privilege of being invisible. And here's what really strikes me. Mary is one of the lucky ones. She works in a country house where conditions are relatively good. The food is adequate. The housekeeper is strict but not cruel. There's even half a day off every other Sunday, though Mary usually spends it sleeping or doing her own mending. In other households, conditions could be much worse. Longer hours, less food, harsher discipline, and in city households, smaller ones, a single maid might have to do the work we've just described for multiple servants, all by herself for even lower wages. The wonder isn't that some servants rebelled or ran away. The wonder is that most of them stayed, that they endured this life year after year until they were too old or too worn out to continue, that they maintained standards of work that would exhaust a modern person in a few days. But they did, they endured, and in the process, they made possible the comfortable, elegant, seemingly effortless deepest of the families upstairs. Every moment of leisure enjoyed by the wealthy was built on hours of labour by people like Mary. Every beautiful room, every delicious meal, every perfectly pressed garment represented invisible work done by invisible hands. So the next time you're tired after a long day at work, Think about Mary. Think about those 18-hour days. Think about being 17 years old and already having hands like a woman twice your age. Think about sleeping in a freezing attic and waking before dawn to clean out fireplaces in silence. And then think about the fact that while Mary was doing all of this, there was someone else in the house who wielded even more power, who commanded even more respect, who made even the housekeeper nervous, the butler, the king of the downstairs world. And in our next part, we're going to enter his kingdom and understand why everyone, family and servants alike, treated this man with something approaching awe. Stay close. Mary's day exhausted you, didn't it? 18 hours of relentless labour answering to everyone, having no authority over anything except perhaps the cleanliness of the grates she scrubbed. But there was someone in that house who had power, real power. Someone who commanded respect from both the family upstairs and the servants downstairs. Someone whose word was law in his domain, whose decisions could make or break careers, whose authority was so absolute that even the master of the house thought twice before crossing him. The butler. If you were to enter a grand Victorian estate and ask who truly ran the place day to day, the honest answer wouldn't be the lord or lady of the house, it would be the butler. And understanding his role, the strange combination of servant and sovereign reveals another fascinating layer of this peculiar world. Let me take you into his kingdom. The word butler has an interesting origin. It comes from bouteiller, an old French word meaning bottle bearer or cup bearer. In medieval households, the butler's original job was managing the buttery, the room where alcoholic beverages were stored. He was literally the keeper of the bottles. But by the Victorian era, that role had expanded exponentially. The butler had become the chief executive officer of the below-stairs world, the general commanding the servant army, the prime minister of the household government. Think about what this meant practically. In a large household with 30 or 40 servants, someone had to organize everything. Someone had to create work schedules, assign tasks, maintain standards, resolve conflicts, handle discipline, manage the male staff, coordinate with the housekeeper who managed the female staff, liaise with the family upstairs, and ensure the entire elaborate machine ran smoothly. That someone was the butler. His authority was extraordinary. He hired and fired male servants, footmen, under-butlers, valets, hall-boys. He set their wages within parameters established by the master. He controlled their work lives completely. A footman who displeased the butler might find himself dismissed without ceremony. A hall boy who showed promise might be mentored and promoted. The butler also managed the household accounts for his domain. He kept detailed records of expenditures for wine, spirits, and other provisions under his control. He negotiated with wine merchants and suppliers. He maintained an inventory of the household silver and was personally responsible for its security. That's why his sleeping quarters were always positioned next to the strong room where the valuable silver was kept. Even in sleep, he was on guard duty. At some estates, the butler's responsibilities extended to hiring and paying all servants, not just the male staff. In these cases, he operated as a house steward as well, managing budgets that could run into hundreds or thousands of pounds annually. The level of trust placed in him was remarkable. He had access to significant amounts of the family's money and property. And here's what's fascinating: the butler's social status was genuinely high for a servant. Historical sources suggest that a good butler's rank was considered equivalent to a professional man, a lawyer or a doctor. He wasn't addressed by his first name, always by his surname with respect. Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Pemberton, Mr. Davies. His salary reflected this status. While Mary earned £12 per year, a butler at a grand estate might earn anywhere from £40 to £80 annually, plus room and board, plus clothing allowances, plus tips from guests which could be substantial. The most prestigious butlers at the grandest houses could command even higher wages, but the money came with immense pressure and responsibility. Let me describe a day in the life of a butler, not from the bottom up like we did with Mary, but from the top down. The butler's day typically began earlier than you might expect. By 6:30 or 7 in the morning he was up, dressed in his formal black tailcoat, inspecting the work of the junior servants. Had the boots been properly cleaned? Was the family's breakfast being prepared correctly? Were the morning newspapers ironed? Yes, ironed, to ensure the ink didn't smudge onto the reader's hands. He would open the shutters and doors of the main house, symbolically starting the household's day. He would check deliveries from tradesmen, ensuring quality and correct quantities. He would review the day's schedule with the housekeeper. Were their guests expected? What meals needed to be prepared? What rooms needed special attention? Then came one of his most important duties, managing the wine cellar. A butler needed expertise in wines, spirits, and liqueurs. He selected wines for meals, decanted them at the proper time, ensured they were served at correct temperatures. For a formal dinner party, this required significant knowledge and timing. The wrong wine with a course could be a disaster. Wine served too warm or too cold would be noticed and commented upon. At breakfast, the butler might personally serve the family, or he might supervise footmen doing so. His standards were exacting. Every dish had to be offered from the correct side, every glass had to be filled to the proper level, every plate had to be cleared at precisely the right moment. Throughout the day, the butler was constantly managing, constantly supervising, constantly maintaining standards. He carved the meat at servants' meals, a symbolic gesture of his authority, mirroring the master's role at family meals. He presided over the servants' dinner, maintaining the discipline and decorum we discussed earlier. His presence alone was enough to ensure proper behaviour. In the afternoon he might polish the finest silver himself, work too important to trust to junior servants. He might prepare the dining room for evening dinner, checking every detail personally. He might interview a candidate for a footman position, assessing not just experience but appearance, manner, voice. For evening dinner parties, the butler was a choreographer and performer simultaneously. He supervised the footman serving each course. He ensured wine glasses were always filled but never overfilled. He anticipated needs before they were expressed. A good butler seemed almost psychic. The right dish appeared at the right moment. The right wine was poured without asking. Problems were solved before guests even noticed them. And through all of this, he maintained perfect composure. A butler never showed emotion, never appeared flustered, never acknowledged difficulty. Everything ran smoothly because he made it run smoothly, but he did so invisibly, his labour disguised as effortless perfection. There's a wonderful account from the 1880s of a butler at a Yorkshire estate managing a dinner for 30 guests with only 2 footmen to help him because several servants were ill. The dinner went flawlessly. Guests remarked on the exceptional service. Only after they'd left did the butler allow himself to show exhaustion, collapsing into a chair in the butler's pantry and drinking a restorative brandy. His ability to maintain perfect service despite being short-staffed was considered heroic by those who knew the truth. But being a butler wasn't just about managing costs and maintaining standards. It was about managing people, and people, as we've noted, are complicated. The butler had to handle conflicts between servants, had to discipline without being cruel, had to motivate without the luxury of positive reinforcement. Servants were expected to do their jobs well, simply because that was their job. He had to read people, understand their capabilities and limitations, assign work accordingly. He also had to navigate the delicate relationship with the family upstairs. The butler served them, yes, but he also had a certain authority in household matters. A wise butler could guide family decisions about staffing, about household management, about social occasions. He became a trusted advisor, particularly to masters who didn't want to be bothered with domestic details. There are recorded instances of butlers who essentially ran estates because the owners were absent or uninterested. The family would spend months in London or abroad, leaving the butler in charge of the country house. He would maintain the property, manage the staff, handle emergencies, correspond with the family about household matters. In these cases, his authority approached that of an estate manager. But this power came with vulnerability. A butler's reputation was his career. One major mistake, a dinner party disaster, a theft of silver, a scandal involving staff, and he could be dismissed. Finding another position at the same level would be difficult or impossible. References were everything, and a dismissed butler without a good reference faced a precipitous fall in status and income. So butlers cultivated reputations for reliability, discretion, and competence. They guarded these reputations fiercely. Some became known throughout aristocratic circles. If you can get Jenkins, he's the best in the county. Pemberton from the Devonshire estate is available. Snap him up quickly. The best butlers could essentially choose their positions, negotiating not just salary, but also staff size, authority level, and other perks. A sought-after butler had leverage that ordinary servants could never dream of. Now, let me tell you about the butler's private world because it reveals how the hierarchy worked even among upper servants. The butler's quarters were his personal domain, usually a bedroom and a pantry or office near the dining room and strong room. These spaces were sacrosanct. Lower servants didn't enter without permission. Even housemaids cleaning had to be careful, respectful, unobtrusive. In his pantry, the butler kept his most important tools, the keys to the wine cellar and strong room, his accounts books, his personal supply of fine wine and spirits. Yes, butlers often had their own stock, better than what the lower servants drank. His silver polishing equipment, his professional library, books on wine, on service, on household management. This was his throne room, and when he sat there after a successful dinner party reviewing the evening, making notes about what went well and what needed improvement, he was every inch the master of his domain. But here's the paradox that defined the butler's existence. For all his power downstairs, he had no power upstairs. For all his authority over servants, he was still a servant himself. He could command footmen and housemaids, but he couldn't refuse an order from the family. He might earn more than a schoolteacher or a shop manager, but he lived under someone else's roof, followed someone else's schedule, devoted his life to someone else's comfort. Some butlers made peace with this, found satisfaction in excellence, in running a perfect household, in the respect they commanded within their sphere. They took pride in their work and accepted the limitations of their position. Others chafed at it, resented serving people they considered less intelligent or capable than themselves, dreamed of somehow escaping service, though the paths out were few. A butler in his 40s or 50s had limited options. His skills were specialized. His entire career had been in service, and leaving meant giving up security for uncertain prospects. There's a memoir by a former butler written in the 1920s that captures this ambivalence beautifully. He writes, "I was the master of a small kingdom, but a kingdom I could never truly own. I commanded respect and had authority over dozens of people, yet I could not choose when to wake, when to sleep, when to take a holiday, or how to spend my days. I was powerful and powerless simultaneously. I was essential and utterly replaceable. It was a strange existence, and I am not certain even now how I feel about those years." That complexity, that simultaneous power and powerlessness, is at the heart of the butler's role. And there was one more layer to this. The butler wasn't just managing a household, he was managing a performance. The elaborate theatre of Victorian upper-class life required him to be stage manager, director, and sometimes actor. The seamless service, the perfect meals, the elegant dinner parties, these were productions, and he made them happen. When guests arrived at the front door, the butler greeted them with formal dignity. When dinner was announced, he did so with perfect timing and diction. When crises occurred, a dish burned, a servant ill, a guest making difficult demands, he solved them invisibly, ensuring the performance continued without interruption. This theatrical aspect of the role required not just organisational skills but emotional control. The butler had to embody calm authority at all times, had to project confidence even when improvising frantically, had to make the difficult look easy and the complex appear simple. Some butlers were brilliant at this, became legendary for their unflappability, could handle any situation with aplomb. These men were treasured by their employers and famous among their peers. Others struggled with the constant performance, found the emotional labour exhausting, cracked under pressure and made mistakes that haunted their careers. The butler's kingdom was real, but it was also fragile, built on reputation, maintained through constant effort, vulnerable to forces beyond his control. A change in the family's fortunes could mean his position disappeared. The master's death could mean a new master with his own preferred butler. Fashion shifts could make his style of service seem old-fashioned. By the early 1900s, the butler's world was already changing. The elaborate formal service he'd mastered was becoming less common. Families were entertaining more casually. Some households were experimenting with serving meals in newer styles that required fewer servants. The rigid hierarchy was loosening. And after World War I, as we'll discuss later, the entire system collapsed. Butlers found themselves obsolete, their highly specialized skills suddenly unmarketable. Many ended up in reduced circumstances, managing much smaller households or working in hotels and clubs, still in service but in diminished roles. But in the Victorian and Edwardian heyday, the butler was a figure of genuine authority and respect. He was the bridge between upstairs and downstairs, the translator of the family's wishes into household action, the guardian of standards and traditions, the keeper of silver and secrets. And now you understand why Mary, exhausted from her 18-hour day, still straightened her apron and stood at attention when the butler passed by in the corridor. Why other servants spoke to him deferentially, called him Mr., moved aside when he walked through. His authority was real, earned through knowledge and competence and the absolute trust of the family he served. The butler's kingdom was elaborate, demanding and powerful, and yet it was still a kingdom within someone else's empire. Still a domain that could be taken away with a word. Still a life lived in service, no matter how elevated the service was. But if the butler was the king of the downstairs world, there was a queen as well. Someone whose authority mirrored and sometimes rivaled his, someone who controlled the female servants with the same absolute power he wielded over the males. The housekeeper. And her empire, built on keys and accounts and the surveillance of young women, was just as complex and contradictory as his. Let's enter her domain now. There's a room in every great house that most people never saw. Not the family, not guests, sometimes not even the lower servants. It was positioned strategically, usually near the heart of the servants' quarters but distinctly separate. It had a lock on the door, a fire that burned even when fires in other servants' rooms didn't. Comfortable furniture, perhaps a carpet on the floor, and inside this room sat a woman who wielded more power than many people realize. She controlled keys to every locked cupboard in the house. She managed budgets that would make your head spin. She could hire you, fire you, or make your life miserable with a single word. And she was called Mrs., always Mrs., even if she'd never been married in her life. Welcome to the housekeeper's domain. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. In the intricate hierarchy of a grand Victorian household, the housekeeper wasn't just a senior servant. She was, in many ways, a shadow mistress of the house. While the lady of the house concerned herself with social engagements, correspondence, and entertaining, it was the housekeeper who actually ran the place. Every day, every detail, every problem. Think about what this meant practically. In a house with 20 or 30 servants, someone had to manage them all. Someone had to keep track of supplies, how much tea was consumed, how many candles were used, when the linen needed replacing, whether the soap stores were running low. Someone had to maintain accounts, document expenses, justify costs to the master. Someone had to handle the endless small crises that arise when you have dozens of people living and working in close quarters. That someone was the housekeeper. Her room, usually called the housekeeper's room or sometimes the housekeeper's sitting room, was her throne room. At estates like Tatton Hall in Cheshire, you can still see this room today preserved as it was. A comfortable space with a writing desk, proper seating, good lighting. This is where she did her paperwork, yes, but it was also where she held court. After the servants' midday dinner, remember that formal silent meal we talked about with Mary? The upper servants would retire to the housekeeper's room for dessert and wine. This was a privilege. The butler, the lady's maid, the valet, the head cook. These were her peers, and in this room away from the lower servants, they could speak more freely, discuss household matters, even gossip a little about the family upstairs. But the room's real power lay in what it contained. See, the housekeeper controlled the still room, a separate space where preserves were made, tea was prepared, and medicines were sometimes mixed. She had keys to the linen cupboards, where hundreds of pounds worth of fine linens and tablecloths were stored. She controlled the china closet, housing the expensive porcelain and crystal that could cost more than a servant's yearly wages for a single piece. At Shugborough Estate in Staffordshire, historical records show that the housekeeper's closets contained everything from the finest French china to everyday pottery, from embroidered napkins to simple kitchen towels. She knew the inventory of every single item, had to account for breakages, had to prevent theft. Yes, servants sometimes stole, usually out of desperation. This meant the housekeeper carried an enormous ring of keys, heavy iron keys, each one labelled or recognisable by touch. These keys were both practical tools and symbols of her authority. When she walked through the house, those keys jangled. Everyone heard her coming. Everyone knew what those keys meant. Access, control, power. Now here's something fascinating about the title Mrs. In Victorian society, married women were called Mrs. and unmarried women were called Miss. But housekeepers were always called Mrs. regardless of their marital status. This was a mark of respect, acknowledging their senior position. It elevated them above the regular servants. A 25-year-old housemaid was just Mary or Jane or Ellen, but a 30-year-old housekeeper was Mrs. Thompson or Mrs. Ward, even if she had never been anywhere near a marriage. Why did they remain unmarried? Well, the job was demanding. If you married, you were expected to leave service and focus on your own household. So women who became housekeepers often chose the position over marriage. It offered security, relative comfort, authority, and a salary that could be quite good, anywhere from £20 to £50 per year in the late Victorian era, depending on the size of the household. Compare that to Mary's £12 as a housemaid. £50 a year might not sound like much to us, but remember, room and board were provided, clothing allowances were given, and there were often tips from guests. A housekeeper could save money, could retire with a nest egg, could even, in some cases, open her own boarding house or small business after leaving service. But let me tell you what the job actually required, because it was far more complex than you might imagine. first education. A housekeeper needed to be literate, truly literate, not just able to sign her name. She had to keep detailed accounts in a household book. Every penny spent had to be recorded, categorized, justified. At the end of each month, she would present these accounts to the mistress or sometimes directly to the master, explaining any unusual expenses. Imagine that responsibility. You're managing the household budget for an estate that might spend hundreds of pounds per month just on food, candles, coal, soap, and other consumables. You have to negotiate with tradesmen, the butcher, the grocer, the chandler. You have to inspect deliveries to ensure quality. You have to prevent waste while maintaining standards. If costs are too high, you'll be questioned. If quality drops, you'll be blamed. One housekeeper's account book from 1887, preserved in an estate archive, shows meticulous entries. March 2nd, candles, £3, 4 shillings 6pence. March 3rd, soap, £1, 2 shillings. March 5th, replacement tablecloth after wine stain could not be removed, £5. That last entry has a note. Due to Footman's carelessness. You can almost feel her irritation through the page. But accounting was just one aspect. The housekeeper also had to manage people, and people, as you know, are complicated. She supervised all the female servants, housemaids, chambermaids, laundry maids, still room maids, dairy maids if there was a dairy, nursery maids if there were children. She determined their schedules, assigned their tasks, monitored their performance. She could discipline them for infractions, dock their wages for breakages, or recommend dismissal for serious offences. Think about the psychological skill this required. You're managing a team of women ranging in age from maybe 13 to 40, from different backgrounds, with different temperaments. Some are hard-working and eager to please. Some are sullen and resentful. Some are skilled. Some are clumsy. You have to motivate them, train them, correct them when necessary, and maintain discipline. All while not being so harsh that they quit or rebel, and rebellion, though rare, did happen. There are recorded cases of servants leaving positions en masse when a housekeeper was too cruel. The staff at one estate in Yorkshire walked out together in 1893 after the housekeeper allegedly struck a young scullery maid. The scandal made local newspapers, which was mortifying for the family. So good housekeepers learned to balance firmness with fairness. They maintained standards without being tyrants. They commanded respect through competence rather than fear. But beyond management and accounting, housekeepers needed extensive practical knowledge. They had to understand cleaning, which methods work for which materials, how to remove different types of stains, how to preserve fabrics. They needed to know about food storage and preservation. They needed basic medical knowledge for treating servants' minor injuries and illnesses, because you couldn't call a doctor every time someone cut their finger or caught a cold. Some housekeepers became famous within their circles for specific skills. There was a housekeeper at Erdig in Wales known throughout the region for her furniture polish recipe. Another at a Scottish estate was renowned for her ability to organise house parties, where everything ran so smoothly the family barely had to think about logistics. Historical records from Lanhydrock in Cornwall mention a housekeeper named Mrs. Daw, who managed the household during the late 1800s. She oversaw approximately 20 female servants, managed quarterly budgets of over £200 for household supplies, and according to family letters, ran the estate so efficiently that the mistress of the house once wrote to a friend, "I hardly need concern myself with domestic matters. Mrs. Daw handles everything with such capability that I am quite free to pursue my interests." That's power. That's respect. The mistress of the house, a wealthy aristocratic woman, freely admitting that her housekeeper was so competent that she could essentially ignore household management. But power came with pressure. The housekeeper's reputation, her entire future employment prospects, depended on maintaining her current household standards. One major failure could end her career. If there was a disaster during an important dinner party, it was her fault. If the mistress found dust somewhere, it reflected on her. If a maid misbehaved, she should have prevented it. And there was another, darker aspect to her role. She was expected to monitor the morality of the female servants. Remember when we talked about the separate sleeping arrangements for male and female servants? The housekeeper's room positioned at the end of the female corridor? This wasn't just about convenience, it was about surveillance. Victorian society was obsessed with female virtue. An unmarried woman who became pregnant brought shame not just on herself but on her employer. So housekeepers were expected to prevent romantic entanglements. They monitored who spoke to whom. They enforced rules against followers, the Victorian term for sweethearts who might visit servants. They watched for signs that any maid might be involved with a male servant or, God forbid, with a young man from the family upstairs. Can you imagine that responsibility? Being held accountable not just for work performance but for the personal behaviour of a dozen young women, some of whom were teenagers, far from home, naturally interested in romance and relationships. It must have been exhausting. And yet many housekeepers took this role seriously. They saw themselves as protectors of the young women under their authority, because they understood the consequences. A pregnant unmarried maid would be dismissed without a reference, would probably end up in desperate poverty, might turn to prostitution just to survive. The housekeeper who prevented this, through vigilance, through rules, through harsh discipline if necessary, could justify her strictness as a form of protection. There's a memoir written in the 1920s by a former housekeeper named Margaret Thomas. She describes her years in service at various estates and talks candidly about this aspect of her work. She writes, "I know the younger maids sometimes thought me cruel in my restrictions on their free time and associations, but I had seen what became of girls who were not properly supervised. I could not, in good conscience, allow such fates to befall any girl under my charge." That's the complexity of the role. The housekeeper could be both oppressor and protector, strict disciplinarian and caring guardian. It depended on her personality, her experiences, her beliefs. Now, let's talk about something that reveals just how stratified this world was. Within the servants' hierarchy, there was what we might call an upstairs and downstairs even among servants. The upper servants, butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, valet, head cook, formed an elite group. They ate separately, they socialized separately, they had their own standards and expectations. The housekeeper was part of this elite. She dined with her peers, not with the housemaid she supervised. And here's where it gets interesting. She often had her own servant. Lower servants might clean her room, make her bed, even bring her meals. The very highest status servants had servants waiting on them. Think about that hierarchy. At the bottom you have the scullery maid scrubbing pots 14 hours a day. Several levels above her you have a housemaid like Mary. Above Mary you might have a head housemaid. And above her you have the housekeeper, who has enough status that other servants serve her. It's hierarchies within hierarchies within hierarchies. At large estates, the housekeeper's authority extended beyond the house itself. She might oversee the still-room maids who made preserves from the estate's fruit. She might coordinate with the head gardener about which vegetables were needed in the kitchen. She might manage the dairy maids if the estate had its own dairy producing butter and cheese. There's a wonderful example from Abbey Lakes in Ireland. The estate account books from the 1890s show the housekeeper purchasing whiskey for servants' punch during special celebrations. She had the authority and the budget to provide treats for the staff during holidays. She could boost morale, create goodwill, maintain loyalty through these small gestures. but she also had the authority to make life miserable. A housekeeper who disliked you could assign you the worst tasks, give you the coldest room, find fault with everything you did, and eventually orchestrate your dismissal. She didn't need to be overtly cruel, she could simply make your life so unpleasant that you'd quit. This is why servants were terrified of getting on the housekeeper's bad side. Your entire livelihood, your housing, your food, your future employment prospects, all of it could depend on her opinion of you. And yet for all this power within the household, the housekeeper was still a servant. She still answered to the mistress, still had to defer to the family, still had to maintain that peculiar Victorian balance of authority downstairs and subservience upstairs. There are accounts of housekeepers who managed this balance beautifully, who commanded respect from both servants and family, and there are accounts of those who struggled with it, who became bitter or harsh or resentful. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper we met in Mary's story, fell somewhere in the middle. Strict but not cruel, competent but not warm. She'd been in service since she was 14, had worked her way up from scullery maid to housemaid to head housemaid to housekeeper over 25 years. She knew every task intimately because she'd done them all herself. This gave her credibility but also made her exacting. She knew exactly how long each task should take, exactly how well it should be done, and she accepted no excuses. When she walked through the house, keys jangling at her waist, servants straightened up, work intensified, conversation stopped. Her presence was enough to change the entire atmosphere of a room, and yet, and this is important, she was also the person servants went to with problems. A maid feeling ill would report to Mrs. Thompson. A servant having trouble with a task would ask her advice. She was stern, yes, but she was also knowledgeable, experienced, and ultimately responsible for their welfare. So here's what I want you to understand about the housekeeper. She was neither villain nor hero. She was a woman navigating an incredibly complex role in a rigid hierarchical system. She had more power than most servants could dream of, but that power came with enormous responsibility and pressure. She could shape the lives of those beneath her, for better or worse, and her own life was shaped by the role she'd chosen, or had fallen into through circumstance. The housekeeper's empire was real. Her keys opened doors. Her authority shaped daily life for dozens of people. Her decisions affected budgets, careers, and destinies. Within the servants' quarters she was royalty, but step outside those quarters, and she was still just a servant, expected to be invisible when the family passed by. That's the paradox at the heart of the servant hierarchy. The most powerful servant still had no power at all compared to even the youngest member of the family upstairs. The housekeeper might control keys to every cupboard in the house, but she couldn't unlock the door to social mobility, couldn't access the world of leisure and luxury that surrounded her, could only enable it for others while remaining forever on the outside. But speaking of that world upstairs, there's something we haven't talked about yet, something that might surprise you, because while servants work those 18-hour days we discussed, they didn't starve. In fact, in some ways, they ate better than you might imagine. The food that came back from the family's table, the leftovers from those elaborate meals, well, that all ended up somewhere. And in our next part, we're going to explore the strange hierarchical food system of these grand estates. Who ate what, when, and why? Trust me, some of what we discover is going to be absolutely fascinating. So stay with me as we head to the most chaotic, hot, and surprisingly democratic space in the entire house, the servants' hall at mealtime. Here's something that might change how you think about servant life. When we picture Victorian servants, we imagine them eating gruel and stale bread, right? Living on scraps, barely surviving. And for many poor people in Victorian England, that image was absolutely true. But for servants in grand estates, the food situation was actually far more complicated, and in some ways surprisingly good. Let me paint you a picture. It's 8:30 in the evening at a country estate in Gloucestershire, 1892. Upstairs, the family and their guests have just finished a 7-course dinner. Soup, fish, entree, roast game, savoury, dessert. Each course beautifully presented on fine china served by silent footmen, accompanied by different wines. The conversation has been sparkling, the food exquisite. But here's the thing. The family, corseted and constrained by etiquette, have picked at their food. They've taken small, delicate portions. They have tasted dishes but rarely finished them. Because eating heartily wasn't ladylike or gentlemanly, Victorian dining was about display, about showing you could afford abundance, not about actually consuming it. So what happened to all that food? It came back downstairs, and this is where things get interesting. Picture the moment when those serving platters return to the kitchen. There's still half a roasted pheasant on one, an entire fish barely touched on another, venison that only had a few slices carved from it, elaborate jellies and creams that the ladies declined because they were watching their figures, soufflés that couldn't be saved, ices melting in their crystal dishes. The experienced servants knew this moment was coming, had been anticipating it all evening, because after the upper servants took their pick and after the regular servants got their share, this abundance would form the basis of supper in the servants' hall. Cold chicken, anyone? How about some pheasant? A bit of that expensive imported cheese? Perhaps a taste of that raspberry fool that cost more to make than a scullery maid earned in a week? This was one of the peculiar paradoxes of servant life. You worked like a dog, yes. You had no freedom, true. You slept in terrible conditions, absolutely. But you might eat better than you ever would have in any other working-class job. Better even than many middle-class families who had to budget carefully for their own food. Let me give you some context about Victorian food to help you understand why this mattered so much. For the average working-class family in Victorian England, people working in factories, in mines, in shops, food was basic and monotonous: bread, bread, and more bread. Potatoes, some cheese if you were lucky, perhaps a bit of bacon or fish once a week, tea so weak you could see through it, because the same tea leaves were used 3 or 4 times. Milk was often unavailable even for children. Meat was a luxury reserved for Sundays, if that. But for servants in grand houses, their guaranteed daily meals included meat, vegetables, bread, beer or tea, and often dessert. The food wasn't fancy by the family's standards, but compared to what their families back home were eating, it was a feast. The formal servants' dinner at 12:30 each day might include roasted meat, beef, pork or mutton, with potatoes and seasonal vegetables. There would be plenty of it because servants needed energy for physical labour. Bread, always bread, baked fresh in the estate's own ovens. Beer or ale, which was safer to drink than water and less alcoholic than modern beer. And on Sundays something special, perhaps a pie or a pudding. But it's the system of leftovers that really reveals the complexity of servant food culture. See, food moved through the household in a strict hierarchy. After the family finished their meal, the serving platters came back to the kitchen. The butler and housekeeper had first choice. They could pick what they wanted for their private supper in the housekeeper's room. Remember that post-dinner gathering we talked about? The upper servants retiring for dessert and wine? Well, they were also getting first pick of the best leftovers. Imagine being the butler. You've just overseen a successful dinner party. Now you retire with the housekeeper, the lady's maid, and the valet. The cook brings out what's left. You might choose some of that barely touched venison, a selection of cheeses, some of those fancy petits fours, a glass of decent wine, not the expensive vintage the family drank, but better than what the lower servants will get. This was a privilege, a perk of rank, and it was understood and accepted as part of the hierarchy. Then the remaining food would be available to the regular servants, the housemaids, footmen, kitchen maids. They gathered in the servants' hall, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. With the upper servants gone, conversation could flow more freely, and the food, though picked over, was still often extraordinary by working-class standards. Young Sarah, our scullery maid, might taste pheasant for the first time in her life. Mary, the housemaid, might try a cream dessert that her farm labourer father could never afford. Thomas, the footman, might eat fish that had been caught that morning and prepared by a professional French cook. There's a wonderful account from Emo Court in Ireland describing a servants' ball in 1892. The servants' hall was decorated, and a sumptuous supper was provided. The menu included beef and pork with rich, creamy sauces, roast goose, turkey, stuffed with chestnuts, spiced ox tongue, vegetables, pies, tarts, jellies, blancmange, water ices, sorbets and rich fruit cake with cream. A large bowl of punch laced with gin or whiskey and garnished with fruit was served for refreshment. Can you imagine? These were servants, people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, being served a meal that would have been impressive even for middle-class families. This was one night, sure, a special occasion. But it reveals something important. In grand houses, food was abundant enough that generosity to servants was possible without significantly impacting the family's resources. But, and this is crucial, this abundance came with strings attached. You had access to good food only as long as you remained in service, only as long as you followed the rules, only as long as you pleased your employers. The food was another form of control, another golden chain keeping you in your place. And the food itself reinforced hierarchy in subtle ways. The butler carved the meat at servants' meals just as the master carved upstairs. The housekeeper served the vegetables. They presided over the meal, monitoring behaviour, enforcing decorum. In some houses, when the butler lowered his knife and fork, the meal was officially over. If you weren't finished, too bad. If the butler ate quickly, and some did, whether from habit or cruelty, everyone else had to keep pace or go hungry. Imagine that pressure. You're exhausted, you've been working for 6 hours straight. You're ravenous, and you have to eat at someone else's pace while monitoring your table manners and staying silent unless spoken to. The food might be good, but the experience of eating it was still constrained by the system. Now let's talk about the cook, because her position in this food hierarchy was fascinating. The cook was crucial, the family's reputation partly rested on her skills, but she ranked below the butler and housekeeper in the servant hierarchy. This must have been frustrating. She created elaborate meals that impressed guests and brought honour to the house, yet she took orders from the housekeeper and deferred to the butler. At large estates, the cook might supervise a small army. A head cook, an undercook, kitchen maids, scullery maids. The kitchen was her domain, hot and chaotic, with the massive cast-iron range always burning, copper pots hanging from hooks, herbs drying in bundles, and the smell of bread baking mingling with roasting meat and simmering stock. The cook's day started early, 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and lasted late. She had to plan menus, sometimes in consultation with the mistress, but often independently. She had to manage supplies, train her staff, ensure nothing burned or was undercooked, or was improperly seasoned. A single mistake during an important dinner could damage her reputation permanently. But here's what's interesting. The cook also had access to food in a way other servants didn't. She could taste as she cooked, could snack on ingredients, could make sure there were always some treats available for herself and her favourites. This wasn't technically stealing, it was considered part of the job. How could you cook without tasting? There are accounts of cooks who became quite stout from this constant sampling. One memoir describes a cook at a Yorkshire estate who was so round she could barely fit through the doorways, but her pastries were so legendary that the family overlooked her size, and probably her sampling habits too. And cooks had another privilege. They could keep some leftovers for themselves. The bones from roasts, for instance, were traditionally the cook's to use as she wished. She might make stock for servants' meals, yes, but she might also take some home to her family on her day off. Same with drippings, the fat from roasted meats. This was valuable. Poor families used drippings on bread as a treat. A cook could provide this to her family, improving their diet through her position. So within the servant hierarchy, the cook had a unique relationship with food. Not the highest social rank, but perhaps the most direct access to abundance. Now, I want to tell you about something that reveals both the generosity and the limitations of this system. In most great houses, after the upper servants had their pick and the regular servants had eaten, any remaining food left the house entirely. It went to the local poor. At the Regency Townhouse in Brighton, historical records show that excess food was taken to people living in Brunswick Street East, right behind the estate. These were families in desperate poverty, living in cramped quarters, barely surviving. For them, the leftovers from the big house were sometimes the difference between eating and starving. This created a cascade of nourishment flowing down the social hierarchy. From the opulent family dining room to the upper servants' parlour to the servants' hall to the local poor to their animals, food moved through the system, feeding everyone in order of their social rank. It's almost feudal when you think about it. The Lord provides for all beneath him, but in strict order of precedence. Everyone gets fed, but not equally, not even close to equally. And there's something both beautiful and terrible about this. Beautiful because food wasn't wasted, because even the poorest could sometimes taste luxury. Terrible because it made clear that some people's leavings were other people's treasure, that what one person casually discarded was what another person desperately needed. Let me tell you about one specific meal to really bring this home. There's a record from the 1880s describing a typical Sunday dinner for servants at a large estate in Oxfordshire. The menu included roast beef, a proper joint, not scraps, with Yorkshire pudding, roasted potatoes, carrots, and cabbage. This was followed by apple pie with custard. To drink, there was ale for the men and tea for the women. This meal would have been completely out of reach for a farm labourer's family. The beef alone would have cost more than they could afford. But for the servants who prepared it, served it upstairs, and then sat down to eat their own version, it was just Sunday dinner. Normal. Expected. Do you see the psychological impact of this? Servants lived surrounded by abundance. They handled expensive foods daily. They served elaborate meals. They could smell the roasting meat, see the beautiful desserts, touch the fine ingredients. They were intimate with luxury but couldn't claim it as their own. Except, in this one area, food, they could taste it. Literally taste what they could never fully possess. They could eat the same pheasant as the family, just later, colder, already carved. They could try the same cream, just in smaller portions, from simpler bowls. This must have been both a consolation and a torment, a reminder of proximity to wealth and of permanent exclusion from it. There's a saying from this era, the servants eat the same food as the family, just not at the same table. And that phrase captures everything about the system. Same food, different timing, different settings, different meanings. The family ate leisurely, socially, as entertainment. The servants ate quickly, silently, as fuel for more work. But I don't want to make it sound like servants were ungrateful for good food. By the standards of their time and class, eating meat daily, having fresh bread, tasting luxuries, even occasionally, this was genuine privilege. Many servants who came from rural poverty, who'd grown up on endless bread and potatoes with perhaps some cheese, found the food in service to be one of the genuine perks of the job. There's a memoir by a former housemaid who worked in the 1890s. She writes about her first week in service, about sitting down to servants' dinner and being served roast mutton with vegetables and gravy. She says she nearly cried because she'd never had such food. Her family back home was lucky to have meat once a week, and here it was daily. So yes, the system was hierarchical and controlling. Yes, food was another tool of power. But it was also genuine sustenance, genuine nourishment, and for many servants, a significant improvement over their alternatives. And here's one more detail that shows how important food was to servant culture. On special occasions, Christmas, Easter, the family's birthdays, or celebrations like that servants' ball at Emma Court, the quality and quantity of servants' meals increased dramatically. This wasn't required. Families could have kept their servants on basic rations year-round, but many chose to be generous on special days. Why? Partly genuine kindness, sure, but also strategy. Good food built loyalty. A well-fed servant was a content servant. A servant who remembered the incredible feast at Christmas was more likely to stay, to work hard, to speak well of the family to others. Food was investment in staff retention and morale. It's complicated, isn't it? Nothing about this system is simple. The food could be genuinely good and still be a form of control. The generosity could be real and still be strategic. The servants could be grateful and still be trapped. What I want you to take away from this is that when we look at historical systems of power and hierarchy, we have to hold multiple truths at once. Yes, servants were exploited. Yes, their labour was undervalued. Yes, they had no real power or freedom. But also, yes, some aspects of their lives were better than the alternatives available to working-class people. The food was often one of those aspects, and understanding this complexity helps us see these servants as real people making real choices within limited options, rather than just as victims or as grateful beneficiaries of aristocratic largesse. They were neither. They were people navigating a complicated system, taking what benefits they could, while enduring what hardships they must. So we've fed the servants, seen them through their exhausting days, understood their hierarchies. But there's one part of servant life we haven't explored yet, the space where they actually slept. And when I tell you about the conditions in those rooms, about what it was really like to live in those attics and basements, I think you'll have an even fuller picture of the price servants paid for that good food and relative security. Let's climb those narrow stairs to the servants' bedrooms and see what we find in the darkness. There's a room you can visit today at Lanhydrock in Cornwall. It's been preserved exactly as it was in the late 1800s. When you step inside, the first thing you notice is how small it is. Maybe 6 feet wide, 8 feet long. A narrow iron bedstead takes up most of the space. There's a simple wooden chair, a small chest of drawers, and that's it. The ceiling slopes down sharply on one side because you're in the attic, tucked under the eaves. There's a single small window, and in winter, frost would have formed on the inside of the glass. This was a maid's bedroom, and she was one of the lucky ones. She had a room to herself. The contrast is shocking when you've just walked through the family's bedrooms downstairs. The mistress's chamber had a massive 4-poster bed with velvet curtains, a dressing table with a marble top, comfortable chairs, thick carpets, paintings on the walls, and a fireplace that would have been lit every morning before she woke. Her room was warm, spacious, beautiful. The maid who made that bed, who lit that fire, who carried hot water up those stairs every morning, she slept in a space barely larger than a closet, in furniture that would have been considered inadequate even for a lower middle-class family. And here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't considered cruel. This was considered normal, appropriate. This was what servants' quarters were supposed to be like. Let me take you on a tour of where servants actually lived within these grand houses, because the reality was often worse than you might imagine. Start at the top, the attics. In most Victorian and Edwardian country houses, the entire top floor was devoted to female servants' bedrooms. These rooms were under the roof, which meant they were brutally hot in summer and freezing in winter. The sloping ceilings meant you often couldn't stand up straight except in the centre of the room. The windows were small. Remember, from the outside, the architects didn't want large windows disrupting the elegant roofline. At Cannons Ashby in Northamptonshire, a modest-sized house that employed only a handful of servants in the 19th century, you can still see 3 servants' rooms preserved as they were. The difference in status is immediately visible. The housekeeper's room is relatively spacious, with a proper bed, a wardrobe, a comfortable chair, even a small rug. The housemaid's rooms are tiny, barely furnished, cold. The hierarchy was expressed through space and comfort. Your rank determined not just what work you did, but where you slept and how you lived during whatever few hours you weren't working. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Many servants didn't even get their own rooms. Sharing was common, especially for lower-ranking servants. 2 or 3 housemaids might sleep in one of those tiny attic rooms, in narrow beds placed side by side. Privacy was a luxury for upper servants only, and in some houses, particularly smaller urban townhouses where space was at a premium, servants slept wherever they could be fit. There are documented cases of maids sleeping in cupboards, actual cupboards perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, because there simply wasn't room anywhere else. A young scullery maid might sleep on a cot in the hallway outside the kitchen, or in the kitchen itself, being literally the last to bed and first to rise. One account from a servant working in London in the 1880s describes sleeping in what was essentially a converted linen closet. She writes, "My bed was a narrow cot that folded against the wall during the day. The room, if you could call it such, had no window, only a small vent near the ceiling. I could touch both walls simultaneously with my arms outstretched, but I was told I should be grateful to have any private space at all. Grateful for a closet. Think about that." Now let's go to the other extreme of the house, the basement. This is where male servants typically slept, and the conditions were different but equally challenging. Basements were cold and damp. They were partially underground, so natural light was limited. The servants' quarters in basement levels usually had small windows at ground level, maybe allowing you to see people's feet walking by outside. The stone or brick walls held moisture, and in winter they were bone-chillingly cold. The butler's quarters were usually positioned near the strong room where the valuable silver was kept. This wasn't coincidental. Even in sleep he was guarding the family's treasures. His room was typically better than other male servants' rooms, but it was still in the basement, still cold, still damp. Footmen, under butlers, and other male servants had even less space and comfort. At some estates, male servants slept in dormitory-style rooms with multiple beds lined up. At others, they had tiny individual cells that were barely more than closets with a bed. And here's a detail that really brings home the disparity. At many estates, stable boys and grooms slept above the stables, in rooms that smelled perpetually of horses and hay. These rooms were often warmer than the house servants' quarters. Body heat from the horses below rose up, but they were also far from the main house, isolating these workers from the rest of the servant community. The coachmen, who had higher status than stable boys, sometimes had separate cottages on the estate grounds. If they were married, and coachmen were more likely to be allowed to marry than indoor servants, they might live with their families in these cottages. This was actually a significant privilege, though it came with its own complications. Now, let's talk about what was actually in these rooms. because the furnishings tell their own story. The basic servants' room contained an iron bedstead, simple, utilitarian, often quite uncomfortable, a thin mattress, usually stuffed with horsehair or straw, sheets and blankets provided by the employer, though of much lower quality than those used upstairs, a pillow, often flat and lumpy. There would be a chair, wooden, hard, unpadded, maybe a small table if you were lucky, a chest of drawers for your clothes, though servants didn't own many clothes, a washstand with a basin and a pitcher for water, though remember, you'd have to carry water up from the kitchen if you wanted to wash. There was no running water in servants' rooms. A small mirror, perhaps, a candle holder because there was no gas lighting, and later, when gas was installed in the main house, it often wasn't extended to the servants' quarters. You lit your room with candles or, if you were very careful, an oil lamp. And that was it. No decoration, no carpet beyond perhaps a small rag rug beside the bed, no pictures on the walls, no comfort items, everything purely functional. But here's something interesting. Servants were allowed to keep a personal box, a trunk or chest where they stored their few possessions. When servants moved from one position to another, which happened frequently, they carried this box with them. It became their portable piece of home, containing everything they owned. Extra clothes, letters from family, perhaps a book or two if they were literate, maybe a small treasure or keepsake. At the National Trust properties, you can sometimes see these servants' boxes preserved in the bedrooms. They're often quite beautiful, wooden chests with metal fittings, sometimes painted with the servants' initials. These boxes represent both the mobility of servant life and its limitations. Everything you owned had to fit in one box. Now, I want to talk about something we touched on earlier, but needs more exploration: the strict segregation of male and female sleeping quarters. This wasn't just about sleeping in different parts of the house. This was an obsession with moral propriety that shaped the entire architecture. At many estates, male and female servants had completely separate staircases leading to their quarters, separate corridors. Their sleeping areas were deliberately placed as far apart as possible within the building. At some grand houses, there were actually 3 different staircases: the main family staircase, the male servants' stairs, and the female servants' stairs, all running parallel through the house but never intersecting. The architecture was designed to prevent any possibility of improper contact between the sexes, and the housekeeper, remember, slept at the end of the female servants' corridor specifically to monitor them, to hear if anyone left their room at night, to prevent any sneaking about. The surveillance was constant, even during the few hours servants were supposed to be sleeping. Why this paranoia? Well, Victorian society placed enormous emphasis on female virtue and reputation. An unmarried woman who became pregnant brought scandal on herself and her employer. The family didn't want that scandal. But more than that, they genuinely believed they had a moral obligation to protect the virtue of young women in their employment. The result was an architecture of control that extended into the most private hours of the night. Now, let's talk about something that might seem small, but was actually a huge issue: temperature. These servants' rooms had no central heating. In the main house, fires would be lit in bedrooms before the family retired, warming the spaces, but servants' rooms? No fires. Too expensive and also considered unnecessary. Servants were working class, used to hardship, right? They could handle the cold. In winter in the English countryside, temperatures inside those unheated attic rooms could drop below freezing. Remember Mary, our housemaid? Remember her waking in a room where frost had formed on the inside of the window? That wasn't unusual. That was normal. Servants slept in their underclothes, chemises for women, long underwear for men, because it was too cold to sleep any other way. They piled on whatever blankets they had. Sometimes they slept in their stockings, and in the morning when they had to get up in the dark, the cold must have been almost unbearable. There's an account from a former servant describing winter mornings. The water in my washing pitcher was frozen solid. I had to break the ice to wash my face. My fingers were so numb I could barely button my dress. And I had to be downstairs, ready to work, within 15 minutes of waking. There was no time to warm up, no moment of comfort, just cold, then work. Can you imagine that as your daily reality? Not occasionally, not during an unusual cold snap, but every winter for months on end. And in summer, the attics became ovens. The heat rose from below, the sun beat down on the roof, and those small windows provided little ventilation. Servants sweltered in those rooms, barely sleeping, then had to wake before dawn to work another 18-hour day. Now here's something that reveals even more about the disparity. Let's talk about toilets. Upstairs, by the late Victorian era, flush toilets were being installed. Water closets, they were called. Porcelain bowls, running water, the pinnacle of modern sanitation. The family had access to these. Downstairs, the servants used privies, outside toilets, non-flushing holes in the ground, basically. At the Regency townhouse in Brighton, the servants' privy was in the courtyard, so in the middle of the night, if you needed to go, you had to leave the building, go outside and use this little shed in winter, in the rain, in the dark. And the contents of these privies were collected by night soil men, workers who came around regularly to empty them and cart the waste away to be sold as fertilizer. The smell must have been terrible, especially in summer. Think about the psychological impact of this. You're a servant in a house with indoor plumbing. You know it exists. You've probably cleaned those beautiful porcelain water closets in the family's bathrooms, but you aren't allowed to use them. You have to go outside to an outhouse like someone living in the Middle Ages. That's hierarchy made visceral. That's class difference expressed through the most basic human needs. Now, I want to tell you about one specific preserved servant's bedroom because it captures so much of what we've been discussing. At the Merchant's House Museum in New York, there's a perfectly preserved example of a typical servant's bedroom from the mid-1800s. It's tiny, about 7 feet by 9 feet. There's a narrow bed, a simple chair, a small table, and a chamber pot under the bed. The room has one small window. The walls are plain plaster, not papered or painted. There's no decoration of any kind. And this is in a prosperous merchant's house, not a poor household. This is what people who could afford nice things provided for their servants. When you stand in that room, you can feel the confinement, the lack of space, of air, of light, of comfort. And you realize that after working all day in the beautiful rooms of the house, after handling fine objects and seeing luxury everywhere, servants retreated to this, to a cell really, a place to sleep between shifts of work. But here's something important to understand. For many servants, particularly those who came from desperate rural poverty, even these stark rooms represented a step up. If you'd grown up in a one-room cottage with your entire family, parents, grandparents, 6 siblings all sleeping in the same space, having your own bed, even in a tiny cold room, was actually an improvement. This doesn't make the conditions acceptable, but it helps explain why so many people chose service and stayed in it. The alternative wasn't better conditions elsewhere. The alternative was often worse poverty, less food security, and no housing at all. There's a memoir by a woman named Margaret Powell who went into service in the 1920s, later than our period, but conditions hadn't changed much. She describes her first night in her servant's room. She was 14 years old. She writes, "I cried myself to sleep that first night. The room was so small and cold and lonely. But then I remembered the overcrowded cottage I'd left behind, where I slept 3 to a bed with my sisters, where there was never enough to eat, and I dried my tears. This was my life now. It was hard, but it was also secure. Secure. That word keeps coming up. Despite the terrible conditions, despite the lack of freedom, despite the indignity and exhaustion, service offered security. A roof over your head, food in your stomach, a position in society, however low. And in those small, cold, uncomfortable rooms, servants dreamed of their rare days off, dreamed of saving enough money to leave service, dreamed of marriage and their own homes, dreamed of a different life while trying to survive this one. The servants' quarters were designed to be adequate for sleep and nothing more. You weren't meant to spend time there except when unconscious. Your life was meant to be lived in service to others, and your personal space reflected that. Minimal, functional, forgettable. And yet these rooms held lives. Real human lives with all their complexity and hope and sadness. Young women lay in those narrow beds and wondered what would become of them. Young men stared at those plain walls and imagined futures they might never achieve. Children, because some servants were barely more than children, cried into their thin pillows for homes and families they'd left behind. These weren't just storage spaces for servants between work shifts. These were homes such as they were, the only private space many servants would ever have, and the starkness of these rooms tells us everything about how Victorian society valued, or didn't value, the people who made their comfortable lives possible. So we've seen where servants slept, how they lived in those few hours they weren't working. But there's one category of servant we haven't discussed yet, and their role was perhaps the most visible, the most performative, the most deliberately theatrical: the footmen. Young men chosen partly for their looks, dressed in an elaborate livery, trained to move like ghosts and stand like statues. They were human decorations, and their story reveals yet another strange layer of this bizarre world. Let's meet them next. Stand perfectly still. I mean it. Try it right now. Stand up, straighten your spine, look straight ahead and don't move, not a twitch, not a shift of weight, not a blink more than necessary. Hold your arms at your sides in a specific position and now stay like that for 2 hours. Can't do it? Neither could most people, but Footman could. Footman had to. Of all the servants in a grand Victorian household, footmen were perhaps the strangest paradox. They were chosen specifically to be seen, unlike almost every other servant who was supposed to be invisible. They were selected partly for their looks, their height, their build, their handsome features. They were dressed in the most elaborate uniforms in the household, sometimes more expensive than what the family themselves wore. They stood in prominent places, visible to guests, on display like artwork. And yet, despite being constantly seen, they were still supposed to be somehow absent. Present but not present. Decorative but not human. Living furniture. Let me explain what I mean by taking you through the process of how someone became a footman. First, the physical requirements. Footmen needed to be tall, 5 feet 10 inches at minimum, though 6 feet or taller was preferred. They needed to be well proportioned, with good posture and pleasant features. Some families were particular about specific attributes. Fair hair was fashionable in some households, dark hair in others. Clean shaven was required everywhere, though sideburns were acceptable if well groomed. And here's the strange part. Families wanted their footmen to match. If you employed 2 footmen, they should be similar heights, similar builds, similar colouring. 3 footmen, even more matching. It was about visual harmony, about creating an aesthetic. Footmen were human accessories, chosen to complement the decor. The hiring process reflected this. When a household needed a new footman, the butler would review applications, yes, but appearance was as important as experience. Sometimes more important. A handsome young man with no training could be taught. An experienced servant who wasn't tall or good-looking enough simply wouldn't do. There are advertisements from Victorian employment agencies that are shockingly explicit about this. One from 1885 reads, "Wanted, second footman, must be 6 feet or above, fair complexion, good teeth, well made, experience preferred but not essential for right appearance, good teeth." They specified good teeth because footmen would be visible to guests. Once hired, the footman was fitted for his livery. And this is where the display really began. Livery was the uniform footman wore, and it was spectacular. We're talking about knee breeches, those short pants that ended just below the knee, worn with white silk stockings that showed off the legs. A tailcoat, often in the family's colours, sometimes with gold or silver buttons embossed with the family crest. A waistcoat also in the family colours. White gloves. Powdered hair in some households, though this was declining by the late Victorian era, and shoes with buckles, polished to a mirror shine. The livery could cost more than a housemaid's yearly wages. It was an investment in display, in showing guests that this family could afford servants who looked like this. But here's the thing about those knee breeches and silk stockings. They were deliberately old-fashioned by the late 1800s. Regular men were wearing long trousers, had been for decades. Knee breeches were archaic, a throwback to the 18th century, but that was the point. The outdated uniform said, "We are so grand, so traditional, so aristocratic that we maintain the old ways. We can afford to dress our servants in historical costume." And those silk stockings, they showed off the footman's legs. This was part of the display. Strong, well-shaped calves were actually a job qualification. Some footmen were rumoured to pad their stockings to improve their appearance. It was objectification, pure and simple. These young men were being selected and dressed to be ornamental. Now, what did footmen actually do? Their work was varied, but it was always performative, always visible. First footman, the highest ranking, had the most prestigious duties. He might accompany the lady of the house on outings, standing behind her chair at social events, helping her in and out of carriages, carrying packages when she shopped. He served at family meals, moving silently around the table, offering dishes from the left, clearing from the right, pouring wine with practiced precision. He assisted the butler with important tasks like decanting wine and polishing the finest silver. Second and third footmen did supporting work. They answered the door when visitors called, announcing guests with formal precision. They carried messages between rooms. They served afternoon tea. They stood at attention during dinner parties, ready to leap into action if needed, but otherwise motionless. And here's where it gets really strange. Sometimes footmen's entire job was just to stand there. During grand dinners or balls, footmen would be positioned throughout the house, one at the front door, one at the bottom of the grand staircase, one outside the drawing room, one in the entrance to the dining room. They stood at attention in their spectacular livery, holding themselves perfectly still for hours, adding to the atmosphere of grandeur. Guests would walk past them, and the footmen were supposed to look straight ahead, unmoving, barely seeming to breathe. They were human pillars, living statues. Their presence said, "This household is so wealthy, we can afford to employ young men just to stand beautifully." One memoir from a former footman describes standing at attention during a ball that lasted from 9 in the evening until 3 in the morning, 6 hours. Standing, not sitting, not leaning, not fidgeting, just standing. His feet swelled in his tight shoes, his legs cramped, his back ached, but he couldn't show it, couldn't grimace or shift his weight or do anything that would break the illusion, because that's what it was, an illusion, the illusion of effortless grandeur. And footmen were essential to maintaining it. But the job wasn't just standing around looking pretty. Footmen did actual physical labour, and often the contrast between their decorative appearance and their practical work was absurd. They carried coal scuttles upstairs to keep fires burning. They moved heavy furniture when rooms were being rearranged, They hauled trunks and luggage when the family travelled. They cleaned boots and shoes, and in a large household with family and guests, this could mean polishing dozens of pairs every single day. They trimmed lamp wicks and filled oil lamps, which was dirty, smelly work. They carried messages across large estates, sometimes walking miles in a day. They served meals, which meant carrying heavy trays and platters, holding them at the correct angle while standing perfectly still while someone decided whether they wanted more potatoes. Imagine doing hard physical labour while wearing knee breeches, silk stockings and a tailcoat with tight shoulders. Imagine trying to carry a coal scuttle up 3 flights of stairs without getting a speck of coal dust on your pristine white gloves. Imagine polishing 20 pairs of boots until you can see your reflection, then having to scrub the blacking off your hands before you can put those white gloves back on to serve tea. The disconnect between the ornamental appearance and the practical reality must have been maddening. And there was another aspect to footman life that we need to talk about: the attention they received. Because footmen, being young, handsome and highly visible, attracted attention, sometimes wanted, often unwanted. Female guests sometimes flirted with footmen, left notes, made inappropriate comments. The footman, of course, could do nothing, had to stand there, maintain his neutral expression, pretend he hadn't heard. Any response, any acknowledgement could cost him his position. There are recorded instances of footmen being dismissed because a guest's flirtation had become too obvious, embarrassing the family. Not the guest's fault, of course. The footman's fault for somehow being too attractive, too noticeable. The victim blamed and punished. And then there was the attention from within the household. Young housemaids might develop crushes on handsome footmen. But remember those strict rules about segregation, about preventing romantic entanglements among servants? Those applied especially strictly to footmen. They were often monitored even more carefully than other male servants, because the combination of their looks and their proximity to young maids was seen as dangerous. A footman caught having any kind of romantic involvement with a maid would almost certainly be dismissed immediately. The financial investment the household had made in him, training, expensive livery, the reputation associated with having good-looking footmen, all of that would be thrown away if he stepped out of line. So footmen lived under this peculiar pressure, selected for their attractiveness, but punished if that attractiveness caused any complications, put on display but expected to somehow be asexual, unaware of the attention, completely focused on their duties. Now, let's talk about wages, because this reveals another layer of the footman's complicated position. Footmen were paid more than most other male servants except the butler. A first footman might earn £30 to £40 per year, plus room, board, livery, and tips from guests. Those tips could be substantial. When guests stayed at a country house for a weekend, they were expected to tip the servants who attended them. A generous guest might give a footman £0.50 or even 5 shillings. During a busy season with many guests, tips could add significantly to a footman's income. But the higher wages and tips came at a cost. Footmen had less job security than other servants. Fashion changed. If short footmen became fashionable, and you were tall, you might find yourself looking for a new position. If you gained weight or lost your looks through age or illness, you could be dismissed. Your employment literally depended on your appearance. There's a sad account from the early 1900s of a first footman who was injured in an accident and lost several teeth. He was dismissed within a week despite having worked for the family for 8 years. His appearance was no longer acceptable. His actual competence, his experience, his years of loyal service, none of that mattered as much as the fact that he no longer looked the part. The job also had no future. You could be a footman in your 20s and 30s if you maintained your looks. But what then? Unlike a butler who could remain in position until retirement, or a housekeeper who grew more valuable with experience, footmen aged out of their roles. Some made the transition to butler or valet if they were smart and lucky. Others found themselves unemployed in their 40s, too old to be footmen but without skills for other positions. It was a young man's job with no clear path forward, and many footmen lived with anxiety about their futures. Now I want to tell you about a specific rule that perfectly captures the paradox of the footman's existence. In many households, footmen were not allowed to wear their own clothes, even on their days off. If they left the house for any reason, they had to wear their livery. Think about what this means. On your rare half-day off, if you want to visit your family or walk in the village or just have a few hours of freedom, you have to do it while wearing knee breeches, silk stockings, and a tailcoat emblazoned with your employer's crest. You can't just be yourself. You can't be anonymous. Everyone who sees you knows exactly who you work for and what your status is. You're never off duty. Even in your free time, you're an advertisement for your employer's wealth and status. Some footmen hated this, felt humiliated walking through towns in their archaic costume while regular men wore modern clothes. But others took pride in it. The livery might be old-fashioned, but it was also expensive, well-made, distinctive. It announced that you worked for an important family. In a world where status mattered enormously, that meant something. There's a photograph from 1912 from Erdidig Estate in Wales showing the staff lined up. The footmen stand near the centre, and you can see their livery, the knee breeches, the fitted coats, the visible pride in their posture. They look formal, almost military. These were young men who had learned to inhabit their roles completely. But look closer at their faces, and you might see something else. A tightness around the eyes, a practiced neutrality of expression. These are people who've learned to be seen, but not known, visible, but not quite real. And that's the essential tragedy of the footman's existence. They were chosen for their humanity, their youth, their handsomeness, their physical presence. But then that humanity was carefully suppressed. They were taught to move like automatons, to stand like statues, to be present without being present. They were the most visible servants in the household, yet in some ways the most invisible. Everyone saw them. No one really looked at them. They were part of the scenery, like the paintings on the walls or the vases on the mantelpieces. Think about spending years like that. Being looked at constantly but never truly seen. Having your appearance praised but your thoughts and feelings ignored. Being valued for how you look but not for who you are. It's a strange kind of erasure. Not invisible, but somehow still absent. And yet, like so much in the servant world, there were compensations. Footmen had status within the servant hierarchy. They had better wages. They often had less physically demanding work than maids or kitchen staff. They saw more of the world, accompanying the family on trips, standing in grand rooms during important events, observing the social world of the wealthy, even if they couldn't participate in it. Some former footmen wrote memoirs later in life, and many speak of their time in service with mixed feelings. Pride in having worked for distinguished families, appreciation for skills they learned, but also a sense of having been used, of having been decorative objects more than people. One former footman wrote, "I was 18 when I entered service, tall, strong, deemed handsome by the agency that placed me. I thought I was lucky, and perhaps I was. I ate well, earned decent wages, saw the inside of great houses, but I also spent years learning to be less than human, to stand so still that guests forgot I was there, to serve meals with such practiced precision that I seemed mechanical, to be looked at but never seen. I don't regret those years, but I don't miss them either." That ambivalence runs through so many servant accounts. The work provided security and opportunity that wouldn't have existed otherwise. but the price, the loss of agency, of freedom, of being able to just be yourself, that price was real and lasting. So the next time you see a period drama with those gorgeous footmen standing at attention in their spectacular livery, remember there were real young men behind those costumes. Men with thoughts and dreams and desires and fears. Men who learned to stand perfectly still for hours. Men who polished boots until their hands were raw and then had to pretend their hands were always clean. Men who were hired for their looks and fired when those looks faded. They were human decorations in houses that valued beauty over humanity. And their story, like so many servant stories, is both fascinating and heartbreaking. But we're not done exploring the contradictions of servant life, because there's one more aspect we haven't touched on. Something that was strictly forbidden but happened anyway. Something that could destroy careers and ruin lives, but that human nature made inevitable. Love, romance, the relationships that formed between servants despite all the rules designed to prevent them. And those stories might be the most human of all. Let's explore that hidden world next. Human hearts don't follow rules very well, do they? You can create architectural barriers, implement strict schedules, enforce harsh penalties. You can separate young men and women as thoroughly as walls and locked doors and watchful housekeepers allow, but you can't legislate away loneliness. You can't prevent attraction. You can't stop people from being people. And in those grand Victorian houses, where dozens of young people lived and worked side by side, where the emotional intensity of hard labour and shared hardship created bonds, where youth and proximity made connection inevitable, love happened. Despite everything designed to prevent it. They were called followers. Such a Victorian term, isn't it? Not boyfriends or sweethearts or suitors. Followers. It sounds vaguely criminal, like someone stalking you. And in the world of Victorian service, having a follower was treated almost like a crime. Let me explain what this actually meant. A follower was anyone courting a servant, potential romantic partner from outside the household. If you were a housemaid and you had a young man from the village who was interested in you, who maybe walked you home on your rare afternoon off, who wanted to marry you someday, he was a follower. And followers were, in most households, absolutely forbidden. The rule books that housekeepers followed were explicit about this. One manual from 1875 states clearly, "No followers are to be permitted. Maids found receiving attention from young men will be dismissed immediately without a reference." No reference meant no future employment, which meant potential destitution. That's how seriously this was taken. But why? Why were Victorian employers so obsessed with preventing their servants from having normal romantic relationships? The official reason was propriety, female virtue, the protection of young women from unsuitable attachments. But dig a little deeper and you find more practical concerns. A maid who was courting might be distracted from her work, might steal food to share with her young man, might become pregnant, which would be an enormous scandal and leave the household short-staffed. And there was another concern: losing trained servants. If a maid married, she was expected to leave service and become a housewife. The household would lose her labour and have to train a replacement. So preventing romantic relationships was partly about staff retention. Keep them single, keep them working. The surveillance was intense. Housekeepers monitored who servants talked to. They watched for signs of attachment, a maid paying more attention to her appearance, seeming distracted, smiling too much. They questioned servants about their activities on their days off. Where did you go? Who did you see? What did you do? In smaller households, where servants lived in close quarters with limited privacy, this monitoring was constant. The housekeeper would notice if a maid received a letter, would question who it was from, might even open and read it to ensure nothing inappropriate was happening. Can you imagine living like that? Being 20 years old and having every letter you receive opened and read by your employer, having to account for every conversation, every walk outside, every moment of your limited free time. And yet, despite all of this, relationships happened, because they always do. Some were secret. Whispered conversations in hallways when no one was watching. Notes passed during errands to the village. Meetings on days off, carefully arranged and anxiously attended, always with the fear of being caught. There's a letter preserved in an archive from an 1880s housemaid to her young man, a farm worker from a nearby village. She writes, "My dearest William, I have only moments to write this before I must return to my duties. Mrs. Thornton watches me like a hawk. I fear she suspects something, but I cannot give you up, though I know my position here depends on secrecy. Meet me Sunday at the old oak tree if you are able. I will try to get away for an hour. Yours always, E." The anxiety in that letter is palpable. The risk she was taking just to spend an hour with someone she cared about. And if she was caught, dismissal, disgrace, her entire future jeopardized. But relationships between servants within the same household, those were even more complicated. Remember how we talked about the architectural segregation? Male and female servants sleeping in different parts of the house, using different staircases, being kept as separate as possible. That was specifically to prevent exactly this, servants falling in love with each other. And yet it happened all the time. How could it not? You're working alongside someone day after day. You see them at their best and their worst. You share the exhaustion, the small triumphs, the frustrations of servant life. You're young, they're young. You're both trapped in the same strange world. Of course, connections formed. In the Victorian era, these relationships were strictly forbidden and could result in immediate dismissal for both parties. The reasoning was that romance between servants would be disruptive. Couples might prioritize each other over their duties. There could be jealousy or drama affecting the household. And if the relationship ended badly, the household would be stuck with former lovers working in close proximity, creating tension. But by the Edwardian era, things were beginning to change. This is important. The early 1900s saw a shift in attitudes about servant relationships, and understanding why tells us a lot about the system's decline. By 1900, servants were becoming harder to find. Young women had more employment options, shops, offices, factories. These jobs might not pay better, but they offered something service didn't. Freedom. Freedom to have a life outside work. Freedom to court young men without permission. Freedom to marry without losing your job. So households found themselves competing for servants. And one way to retain good staff was to relax some of the harsher rules, including the rules about relationships. By the Edwardian period, romance and even marriage between servants in the same household was becoming more acceptable. Not universal and certainly not encouraged, but no longer an automatic cause for dismissal in many houses. There's a wonderful example from a novel called The Girl from Summerhaze, set in this transitional period. A housemaid named Ivy falls in love with Eddie, the chauffeur. In an earlier era, this would have been scandalous, impossible, but in this story their wedding is welcomed by the family. They're allowed to continue working, she is a housemaid, he is a chauffeur, and they live together in rooms above the garage. This wasn't pure fiction. Real households were beginning to make these accommodations, married couples working together, living in cottages on the estate grounds or in converted spaces above stables or garages. It was a compromise. The household kept trained servants, and the servants got to have something approaching a normal life. But this shift also reveals something poignant. It only happened because the system was collapsing, because servants had options. When servants were desperate and plentiful, households could afford to be harsh. But when servants became scarce, suddenly the rules could bend. Now let me tell you about the servants who did manage to marry and what happened to them, because these stories illuminate the system's constraints beautifully. If a female servant married, she almost always had to leave service. This was the expectation. You couldn't be someone's wife and someone's maid simultaneously. Your duty was now to your husband and your own household. For some servants, marriage was an escape route, a way out of service and into a life of their own. Even if they were marrying someone equally poor, a farm labourer, a shop assistant, a skilled tradesman, at least they'd have their own home, however humble. At least they'd answer to no one but themselves and their husbands. But leaving service meant losing the security it provided. No more guaranteed food, housing, or income. If your husband became ill or lost his job, you'd have no safety net. Some former servants found themselves in desperate poverty, looking back on their days in service with regret. Others found happiness. One memoir by a former lady's maid describes her marriage to a village schoolteacher. She writes, "I gave up my position with some trepidation. The wages had been good and I knew the work. But to have my own home, however small, to make my own decisions about how to spend my days, to sit at my own table and eat my own food prepared in my own kitchen. These freedoms were worth the financial sacrifice. I never looked back." Male servants had more options. If a footman or under-butler married, he might transition into a different role, perhaps as an estate manager or gamekeeper, jobs that could accommodate a family. The butler, being senior, might be allowed to marry and remain in position, though his wife couldn't live in the house. She'd have to live separately, perhaps in the village, and he'd see her on his days off. This created its own strange situations. A butler might be the most powerful person in the servants' hierarchy, controlling everyone else's lives, but unable to live with his own wife. He'd sleep in his butler's quarters in the basement. She'd be in a cottage a mile away, and they'd have an abbreviated marriage conducted in stolen moments. The sacrifice required to maintain these positions was extraordinary, and yet many made it, because the alternative, leaving service, finding other work, supporting a family on uncertain wages, seemed even more daunting. Now, I want to talk about something darker that the no followers rule was really about: the vulnerability of female servants. Young women in service were often far from home, cut off from family protection, living under the authority of employers who had tremendous power over them. This made them vulnerable to exploitation, both from outside and within the household. The no followers rule was supposedly protective. By preventing young men from courting servants, households claimed they were protecting their female staff from fortune hunters, from unsuitable men, from potential disgrace. But in reality, the biggest danger often came from within the household itself. Young masters, the sons of the family, sometimes pursued maids. Guests at house parties might proposition servants. Even some butlers or upper servants might abuse their authority over younger staff. A maid who became pregnant faced disaster. She would be dismissed immediately, usually without a reference, often without even acknowledgement of how the pregnancy occurred. If a young master had seduced or forced himself on her, didn't matter. She was the one who'd be punished. There are heartbreaking stories preserved in workhouse records and charity organisation files. Young women, former servants, pregnant and desperate, seeking help. Many ended up in workhouses, essentially Victorian poorhouses where conditions were deliberately harsh. Some turned to prostitution simply to survive. Some died in childbirth in charity hospitals. And the men responsible? They faced no consequences. A young aristocrat who got a maid pregnant might have his allowance docked by his father, might be sent away for a few months until the scandal died down, but his life, his prospects, his future, all intact. This is the dark underside of all those rules about followers and propriety. They weren't really about protecting servants. They were about protecting the family's reputation and maintaining control over servant labour. But let me tell you about the relationships that did work, because they happened too. The couples who found ways to be together despite the system. There's a record from a country estate in Somerset of a housemaid and a footman who worked together for 7 years before they could marry. They saved every penny they could from their wages. They were scrupulously proper, never caught in any impropriety, never giving the housekeeper any reason for suspicion. And finally, when they'd saved enough, they left service together, bought a small shop in a nearby town and lived there for the rest of their lives. Their account book still exists, every shilling saved, documented. The years of waiting, the patience, the determination. It's a love story, but one told in numbers and sacrifice rather than poetry. And there were others, couples who found each other in service and built lives together. They might have started with nothing, but they had each other. Some became successful small business owners, boarding housekeepers, shop proprietors, pub owners. The skills learned in service, organisation, management, dealing with demanding people, translated surprisingly well into running small businesses. These success stories are important because they remind us that servants weren't passive victims of an unjust system. They were people with agency, making choices, finding ways to build lives despite constraints. Yes, the system was oppressive. Yes, the rules were cruel, but people found ways to be human within it. By the time World War I arrived, the entire structure was already cracking. Young women who'd been in service went to work in munitions factories, earning more money with more freedom. Young men went to war, and when it was over, many simply didn't come back to service. The households that had been so strict about followers that had dismissed maids for receiving letters from young men suddenly found themselves begging for staff. And the staff that remained could negotiate, could insist on better wages, more time off, fewer restrictions on their personal lives. The rules about relationships began to matter less because the power dynamic had shifted. Servants had options now, and households that wanted to retain staff had to treat them more like human beings and less like property. There's a 1922 letter from a housekeeper to her employer, complaining that the new young housemaids insisted on having their evenings free and refused to account for how they spent them. She writes with clear frustration. They act as if their time belongs to them. They come and go without seeking permission. When I attempted to question one girl about where she had been, she told me quite boldly that it was none of my concern. The modern servant has no sense of propriety or duty. Reading that letter now, you might think, good for that housemaid. About time. But for the housekeeper, this was the world turning upside down. Everything she'd known, all the rules she'd enforced for decades, suddenly obsolete. The age of strict control over servants' personal lives was ending. Not because employers suddenly became more compassionate, but because they no longer had the power to enforce the old rules. Economics, demographics, and social change accomplished what morality arguments never could. So when we look back at those no-followers rules, at the surveillance and control and punishment, we're seeing a system trying desperately to maintain itself against the inevitable tide of human nature. You can forbid love, but you can't prevent it. You can punish relationships, but you can't stop them from forming. You can dismiss servants for having personal lives, but eventually you run out of servants willing to accept that bargain. The story of forbidden love in Victorian service is really a story about the limits of control, about the stubborn insistence of the human heart to feel what it feels, despite all rules and consequences, about young people finding ways to be together even when the entire system they lived in was designed to keep them apart. And in the end, it's one more reminder that the servants weren't just roles or functions. They were people who fell in love, who made mistakes, who took risks for happiness, who sacrificed and saved and hoped for better futures, people who lived as fully as they could within the constraints they faced. But all of this, the relationships, the rules, the entire elaborate system of service, it was heading toward an ending. A massive upheaval was coming that would shake the foundations of these grand estates and change everything forever. That upheaval was World War I. And in our next part, we're going to explore how the war didn't just change servant life, it essentially ended it. The beginning of the end of a centuries-old way of life. Stay with me. August 1914. A hot summer. In the grand houses of Britain, life was proceeding as it had for generations. Housemaids were cleaning fireplaces, footmen were polishing silver, cooks were preparing elaborate meals, gardeners were tending the grounds. Everything seemed eternal, unchangeable, as solid as the stone walls of the estates themselves. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914, and nobody imagined how completely it would transform everything. The common belief was that the war would be over by Christmas. Young men rushed to enlist, excited for adventure. Families waved them off with patriotic fervour. It all seemed quite glorious, quite noble, quite temporary. But wars have a way of changing things that seem unchangeable. And this war, this terrible, grinding, devastating war, would shatter the entire system of domestic service that had existed for centuries. Let me show you how it happened. The first impact was immediate and obvious. The young men left. Footmen, under butlers, grooms, stable boys, gardeners, they enlisted in droves. Some because they believed in the cause, some because everyone else was going and they didn't want to be left behind. Some because military service, ironically, offered more freedom than domestic service. Think about that for a moment. Young men who'd been living under strict hierarchy, following orders, wearing uniforms, working long hours, they joined the military and found it liberating compared to service. At least in the army, your time off was your own. At least you were fighting for something bigger than keeping a drawing room spotless. By late 1914, households were already struggling to maintain male staff. The butler might still be there, too old for military service. But the footmen were gone. The gardening staff was decimated. Estates that had employed 15 or 20 young men found themselves with perhaps 3 or 4 who were too old, too young, or medically unfit for service. One estate in Yorkshire kept meticulous records. In August 1914, they employed 18 male servants of various ranks. By December, they had 6. By the summer of 1915, they had 3. The head gardener, aged 58, an under butler with a heart condition, a 14-year-old hall boy not yet old enough to enlist. The work still needed doing, gardens still needed tending, fires still needed lighting. So who did the work? The women. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because the war opened opportunities for women in service that had never existed before. Women became gardeners, doing heavy physical labour that had always been considered men's work. Women became chauffeurs, learning to drive and maintain automobiles, wearing practical clothes instead of maids' uniforms. Women took on responsibilities that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. And you know what many of them discovered? They liked it. They were good at it, and they didn't particularly want to go back to being housemaids when the war ended. But the impact went far beyond just redistribution of labour within households. Because the war created employment opportunities outside service that were transformative. Munitions factories needed workers desperately. They paid well, far better than service. A housemaid earning £12 a year could earn that much in a few months in a munitions factory. Yes, the work was dangerous. Yes, the chemicals turned your skin yellow, which is why munitions workers were called canary girls. But you had money, you had regular hours, you had time off that was actually yours. And perhaps most importantly, you had independence. You could live in a boarding house, could spend your wages as you chose, could go to the cinema on your evening off without asking permission, could have a follower without risking dismissal. The taste of freedom was intoxicating. One former housemaid who went to work in munitions wrote in her diary, "I never knew I could feel so alive. Yes, the work is hard and the powder makes my hands ache, but when my shift ends, my time is mine. I can walk down the street without a uniform marking my status. I can laugh with my friends without worrying about being too loud. I can save money and dream of a future that isn't just service in another house. I will never go back." And she didn't. None of them did, really, or at least not in the same way. By 1916, the servant shortage was critical. Households that had once employed 30 or 40 servants were making do with 10 or 12. The grand lifestyle that had seemed so permanent was becoming impossible to maintain. But here's what's fascinating. Many families didn't fully understand what was happening. They thought this was temporary. The war would end, the men would come home, the women would return to service, and everything would go back to normal. They were so wrong. The National Insurance Act of 1911 had already changed the economics of service. Both employers and servants now had to pay threepence per week into a national insurance fund. This doesn't sound like much, but multiply it by 30 servants, multiply it by 52 weeks, and suddenly employing a large staff became significantly more expensive. The war accelerated this economic pressure. With fewer servants available, wages had to increase to attract anyone at all. A housemaid who might have earned £12 a year in 1914 could demand £18 or £20 by 1917. Good cooks, always in demand, could command even higher wages. The economics that had made large staffs possible were crumbling, and without large staffs, the grand houses couldn't function as they had. Let me give you a specific example. There was an estate in Derbyshire, I won't name it, but the family records still exist, that employed 47 servants in 1914. By 1918, they had 11. 11 people trying to do the work of 47. The family had to make choices, close off wings of the house because there weren't enough people to clean them, simplify meals because the kitchen was understaffed, let the gardens go to wilderness because there were no gardeners, cancel house parties because they couldn't accommodate guests properly. The lifestyle that had defined the British aristocracy for centuries was becoming unsustainable. And then the war ended. November 1918. Victory, but at staggering cost. Nearly 1 million British men dead. Countless more wounded, traumatized, changed forever. And among those dead and wounded were many who'd been servants. Do you remember that photograph from Erdig we talked about earlier? The servants lined up in 1912. Some of those young men never came home. Their names are on war memorials in villages across Britain. Footmen who became soldiers, gardeners who became casualties, the ones who did come home, many didn't want to go back to service. They'd seen the world, however terrible that seeing had been. They'd had authority, responsibility, autonomy. The thought of returning to saying yes sir and no ma'am, being invisible again, of following orders about how to polish silver, it was unbearable. There's a memoir by a former valet who served in the trenches. He writes, "I went to war as a servant and came back as a man who'd commanded other men, who'd made life and death decisions, who'd seen and done things I can never speak of. How could I go back to laying out clothes and drawing baths? How could I return to a world where my greatest concern was whether his lordship's boots were shined to perfection? The war was hell, but it also showed me I was capable of more than service." Many veterans felt this way, and the government, to its credit, tried to help. Veterans were given training for trades, small business loans, preference for civil service jobs. Going back into domestic service, where you lived under someone else's roof and followed someone else's rules, wasn't appealing to men who'd survived the trenches, and the women, as I mentioned, many never came back either. Those who'd worked in munitions, in offices, in shops during the war had tasted independence. Post-war, those jobs might have become scarcer, but women had learned they had options. Service wasn't the only path anymore. By the early 1920s, the servant shortage was permanent. Households competed desperately for staff. Wages rose dramatically. Working conditions had to improve or servants would simply leave for better positions. Remember all those strict rules we talked about followers, about time off, about surveillance and control? Most of those had to be relaxed or abandoned entirely. Servants began negotiating their own terms, insisting on private time, refusing to account for their activities on days off, expecting to be treated with basic human dignity rather than as property. That 1922 letter from the frustrated housekeeper I mentioned earlier, that wasn't just one woman complaining. That was the old system recognizing its own death. Let me tell you about a specific house that illustrates this perfectly. Trentham Hall in Staffordshire had been one of the grandest estates in England. Enormous, elaborate, magnificent. In its heyday, it employed over 100 servants, but by the early 1900s it was already in decline. The location, near pottery factories, meant the air quality was poor. The family spent less time there. Maintaining it was so expensive, and after the war, maintaining it became impossible. In the early 1920s, they tried to keep it going with a skeleton staff. But you can't maintain a palace with 10 servants. The house fell into disrepair. And finally, in 1938, they made the decision. The house was demolished, pulled down, one of England's grandest estates simply erased. Trentham Hall was the first, but not the last. Dozens of great houses were demolished in the decades following World War I, not because of bombs or fire or disaster, but because they'd become economically unviable, because the servant system that had made them possible no longer existed. There's a famous Noel Coward song from this era called The Stately Homes of England. It's meant to be funny, but it's also quite sad. The lyrics describe aristocratic families desperately trying to maintain their estates, opening them to tourists selling off treasures, doing anything to generate income. The grand lifestyle, the song suggests, is becoming a performance for paying visitors rather than a lived reality. And that's exactly what happened. The estates that survived did so by transforming into tourist attractions, museums, venues for weddings and events. The servants' quarters that we can visit today at Lanhydrock, at Erdig, at dozens of National Trust properties, they're preserved as historical curiosities, museum exhibits, relics of a vanished world. By the 1930s, domestic service still existed, but it was fundamentally different. Servants were employees rather than dependents. They had legal rights, limited working hours, guaranteed time off. The relationship between employer and servant was becoming more professional, more contractual, less personal, and the numbers tell the story. In 1914, approximately 1.3 million people in Britain worked as indoor domestic servants. By 1930s, that number had dropped to around 1 million. By 1950, it was fewer than 700,000. Today, domestic service as the Victorians knew it simply doesn't exist. There are housekeepers and cleaners and private chefs, of course. But they're service workers with contracts and rights and agencies. They go home to their own lives after work. They're not part of a household hierarchy living under someone's roof, their entire existence structured around service. The world that produced people like Mary, our exhausted housemaid, and Mrs. Thompson, the strict housekeeper, and Thomas, the footman standing at attention for hours, that world is gone. Completely, utterly. It lasted for centuries, seemed permanent and unchangeable, and then collapsed in less than a generation. World War I didn't just kill millions of people, It killed an entire way of life. The trenches of France and Belgium swallowed not just soldiers but a social system. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas lasted 4 years and changed everything forever. And here's what strikes me as both sad and hopeful about this story. Sad because it took a catastrophic war to break a system that had kept hundreds of thousands of people in positions of servitude. It shouldn't have required that much death and destruction to recognise that no one should sleep in a freezing attic after working 18 hours, that young women shouldn't need permission to receive letters, that human beings deserve dignity regardless of their social class, but hopeful because it proves that even systems that seem eternal can change, that people can glimpse better possibilities and refuse to go back to worse ones, that the young women who worked in munitions factories and the young men who served in the trenches came home changed, empowered, unwilling to accept the old bargains. The grand estates fell silent. The bells stopped ringing with quite the same frequency. The kitchens employed 3 people instead of 15. The gardens grew wild. The elaborate social machinery that had required so many human components simply wound down and stopped. And in that silence, in that winding down, there's a kind of elegy. For all the beauty that was lost, yes. For the craftsmanship and the standards and the elaborate rituals, but also for all the lives that had been subsumed into that beauty, all the Marys and Thomases and Sarahs who'd given their youth and health and freedom to make other people's lives comfortable. They're gone now, those servants. All of them. The ones in the photographs from Erddig are long dead. The ones whose names appear in estate account books. The ones who wrote letters and kept diaries and left traces of their actual lives behind the servant roles they played. But their world, the world they lived in, worked in, endured in, sometimes found joy in, that world we can still visit. We can walk through those servants' corridors, can see those bellboards, can stand in those tiny attic rooms, and in doing so we can remember, can honour, can try to understand what their lives were really like. And now, in our final part, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to visit those places where the ghosts of servants still linger, the preserved estates where you can see their world exactly as it was, and we're going to reflect on what this strange, elaborate, beautiful, terrible system of service means for us today, what lessons we can take from it, what it tells us about dignity, about labour, about how we value human beings. Stay with me for this last part of our journey. If you visit Lanhydrock in Cornwall on a quiet afternoon, when most of the tourists have left and the light is fading, you can almost hear them. The footsteps of maids hurrying up the back stairs, the jangle of the housekeeper's keys, the distant clang of a bell summoning someone to the drawing room. The house is silent now, preserved behind velvet ropes and explanatory plaques. But the ghosts are there. Not supernatural spirits, but the echoes of lives lived in service. I've walked through dozens of these preserved estates. Erddig, Shugborough, Tatton Hall, Cannons Ashby, the Regency Townhouse. Each one tells the same story in slightly different ways. Each one preserves the servant's world alongside the family's world, giving equal weight to both. And I find myself drawn to the servants' quarters more than the grand rooms upstairs. Because upstairs you see wealth and privilege that's easy to understand, beautiful paintings, expensive, elegant architecture. It's impressive, certainly, but it's also distant. Most of us will never live in rooms like that, will never own objects like that, will never inhabit that world. But downstairs, in the servants' quarters, that's where the real stories are. That's where you can still feel the humanity of the people who live there. At Erddig, there's something extraordinary. The family who owned the estate for generations had an unusual habit. They commissioned portraits of their servants. Not formal portraits like they had of themselves, but verses and paintings celebrating the people who worked for them. There's a portrait of the housekeeper from the 1700s, of gardeners and grooms and housemaids. These people, who in most houses would have been completely anonymous, were documented, remembered, named. When you stand in front of those portraits, you're looking at real people, people who existed, who had faces and names and lives. It makes everything we've talked about suddenly concrete. That's not just a housemaid, that's Anne, that's Thomas, that's Elizabeth. And in the servants' quarters at Erdig, which are remarkably well preserved, you can see where these actual people lived and worked. You can see the kitchen where they cooked, the servants' hall where they ate, the tiny bedrooms where they slept. There's a particular poignancy to these spaces, because unlike the grand rooms upstairs, which were designed to impress, these rooms were designed for function. They were meant to be used hard and forgotten. The fact that they survive, that we can visit them, feels almost accidental, as if the servants' world was never meant to be seen or remembered. And yet here it is. At Shugborough Estate, they have taken preservation a step further. They have interpreters, people trained to portray Victorian servants. You can watch a cook demonstrate how to prepare food on an 1880s range. You can talk to a gardener about the vegetables they grew. On Wednesdays there's a Meet the Gardener Day where you can walk the grounds and learn about Victorian horticulture. It's part living history museum, part tribute to the people who made these estates function. And what strikes me is how hard the work was. Watching someone actually cook on an open range, managing the heat, coordinating multiple dishes, it's exhausting just to observe. And they did this every single day for hours in a hot, smoky kitchen. At Tatton Hall, the contrast between upstairs and downstairs is preserved perfectly. You can walk from the magnificent Egerton family dining room with its table set with Minton china up to the 24 bedroom with their 4-poster beds and charcoal-heated tin baths. Then you can go downstairs to the basement and see where the servants spent their days, the scullery, the kitchen with its dozens of copper pans and moulds, the housekeeper's sitting room where she managed her small kingdom. The physical distance between these worlds, just a floor or two, feels vast. The emotional distance, unbridgeable. And yet when you visit these places, you realize something important. These worlds were connected, utterly dependent on each other. The grand lifestyle saw upstairs was only possible because of the labour downstairs. Every beautiful room, every elegant meal, every moment of leisure, all built on the invisible work of servants. The National Trust, which manages many of these estates, has done remarkable work in recent years to tell the servants' stories. They've researched the people who lived in these houses, found their names in census records, in account books, in parish registers. They've brought their stories out of the shadows. At some properties you can see the actual bellboards still mounted on the walls. At Lanhydrock, the bells from the 1800s are preserved exactly where they hung, each one labelled Master's Bedroom, Drawing Room, Lady's Chamber. The wires that once connected them throughout the house are gone, but the bells remain. Silent witnesses to countless summons, countless hurried trips up and down stairs. I stood in front of that bellboard for a long time on my last visit. Tried to imagine what it would have been like to be the person watching those bells, waiting for them to ring, knowing each jangle meant work, meant someone needed something, meant you had to move. Now they're just museum pieces, but once they controlled lives. At the Regency Townhouse in Brighton, you can see servants' quarters that haven't been significantly altered since they were built. The basement with its stone flags and curved corners, the courtyard with the old privy, the kitchen with racks where the bells once hung. It's remarkably intact, and that integrity makes it powerful. This isn't a recreation. This is the actual space where actual servants lived actual lives. And when you visit these places, something interesting happens. You start to think about service differently, about labour, about the invisible work that makes comfortable lives possible. Because here's the thing, we don't have housemaids and footmen anymore, but we have people who clean our offices, who prepare our food in restaurant kitchen, who deliver packages to our doors, who care for our children and our elderly parents. The specific form of service has changed, but service work still exists, and the questions the Victorian servant system raises are still relevant. How do we value labour that's essential but invisible? How do we treat people who work in service positions? Do we see them as human beings with dignity and worth? Or do we see them as functions, as conveniences? When you stand in a servant's tiny bedroom at Lanhydrock, when you see how small and cold and bare it is, you might feel outrage. How could people be treated this way? How could this be acceptable? But then maybe you think about the people who clean hotel rooms today, who have quotas that force them to work at punishing speed, who throw out their backs and ruin their knees doing physical labour for minimum wage, who are invisible to the guests who benefit from their work. The Victorian servant system was unjust, but have we really moved as far beyond it as we'd like to think? Or have we just made it less visible, less acknowledged? I'm not saying the situations are identical, they're not. Modern service workers have legal protections, labour rights, the ability to change jobs. That matters enormously. But the questions about dignity, about visibility, about how we value essential labour, those questions remain. Walking through these preserved estates, I think about what we've lost and what we've gained. We've lost the craftsmanship, certainly. The standards of service that required a dozen people to produce one perfect dinner party, the attention to detail, the elaborate rituals, the sense that certain things should be done beautifully even if they're difficult. But we've gained something too. We've gained a world where Mary, our exhausted housemaid, could get an education, could choose her own career, could live her own life on her own terms, where Thomas the footman doesn't have to stand perfectly still for hours to earn his living, where young women don't need permission to receive letters from young men they care about. The grand estates remain, many of them. But they're museums now, or hotels or event venues. The National Trust manages dozens of them, keeping the buildings intact, telling the stories of everyone who lived there, not just the aristocratic families, but the armies of servants who made their lives possible. And that shift in storytelling is important. For a long time, when people visited these estates, they heard only about the lords and ladies. The servants were footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. But now, increasingly, the servants' stories are centred. Their names are spoken, their contributions are acknowledged. There's a visitor's book at Erdig where you can write comments. I spent time reading through it. Page after page of people saying things like, "I never knew the servants lived like this." The servants' quarters were the most interesting part. Thank you for telling their stories. People are hungry for these stories, want to understand the lives of ordinary people in the past, want to connect with the humanity of those who lived in ways so different from our own. And I think there's something deeply hopeful about that, about the fact that we preserve these spaces, that we tell these stories, that we refuse to let these lives be forgotten. Because the servants of Victorian and Edwardian England, all million plus of them at the system's height, they mattered. Their labour built and maintained a civilization. Their hands polished the silver, scrubbed the floors, prepared the meals, tended the gardens. Their invisible work made visible grandeur possible. They deserve to be remembered, not as caricatures or stereotypes, not as the staff or the help, but as individuals, as people with names and faces and stories, as people who endured hardship but also found moments of joy, who made friends and fell in love and had dreams, who were more than their roles, more than their uniforms, more than the functions they performed. When this whole system collapsed after World War I, something was lost. the grand lifestyle, the elaborate social rituals, a certain kind of beauty and order. But something was also liberated. The hundreds of thousands of people who'd been trapped in service, who'd had limited options and constrained lives, suddenly had choices, had possibilities, had freedom. And I can't mourn the system, even as I appreciate the preservation of these buildings and the telling of these stories, because systems that treat people as lesser, that value elegance over human dignity, that maintain beauty through oppression, those systems deserve to fall. The ghosts that linger in these grand estates aren't malevolent, they're just present. Reminders of lives lived, work done, hardships endured. They ask us to remember, to understand, to think about what it means to serve and to be served, to consider how we treat people whose labour benefits us, but whose lives we don't see. So if you ever get the chance to visit one of these estates, Lanhydrock or Erdig or any of the dozens preserved by the National Trust and other organisations, I encourage you to go. Walk through the family rooms, sure. Admire the paintings and the furniture and the architecture. But spend time downstairs too, in the kitchens and the servants' halls, in the tiny bedrooms and the sculleries. Stand in front of those bellboards. Imagine the sound of those bells ringing. Think about the people who answered them, the Marys and Thomases and Sarahs who lived in those spaces, who worked in those spaces, whose entire lives unfolded in service to others. Because their stories, the stories we've explored together over these past hours, they are not just history, they're not just interesting artifacts from a vanished world. They're stories about human beings, about dignity and struggle, about adaptation and survival, about the complex relationships between power and service, between visibility and invisibility, between having choices and having none. These stories matter. These lives mattered. And the fact that we can still visit the places where they lived, can still see the spaces they inhabited, can still learn their names and honour their memory, that's important. That's meaningful. So thank you for taking this journey with me, for spending these hours exploring the hidden world of Victorian and Edwardian servants, for listening to their stories, for trying to understand their lives. I hope when you see period dramas now, when you watch those beautiful scenes of elegant dinners and grand balls, you'll think about what we've discussed. You'll see the servants who make it all possible. You'll notice the bells being rung and the work being done. You'll remember that behind every moment of leisure upstairs was hours of labour downstairs. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think about the invisible labour in your own life, the people who make your comfort possible, and you'll see them, really see them, as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The grand estates are quiet now, the bells have stopped ringing, the servants are gone, but their stories remain. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories, they're not really gone at all. They're still there in those preserved corridors and kitchens, still there in the photographs and letters and account books, still there in the memories we keep alive by visiting, by learning, by caring enough to understand. And I think they'd appreciate that. Being seen, finally, being heard, being remembered not as functions or roles, but as people, as individuals who mattered. Thank you for being here with me, for caring about these stories, for listening to the voices of people who are told to be seen, to be invisible, to disappear. We've given them visibility, we've given them voice, and that feels right. Until we meet again for another journey into the strange and fascinating corners of history, take care of yourselves. Remember to see the people around you, really see them. And maybe, when you turn out the lights tonight, think about Mary climbing the stairs to her cold attic room after 18 hours of work. Think about Thomas standing perfectly still in his elaborate livery. Think about all the servants who lived lives of quiet endurance in service to others. Their world is gone, but their stories live on. and now you know them too. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for letting me share this journey with you.